I have served the Duke of Ravenscroft for 23 years, and in all that time I have kept my counsel. A good valet does not speak of what he sees. He does not remark upon the letter his employer reads twice before setting face down on the desk. He does not mention the bruise he noticed under the cuff when he helped his lord dress for dinner, or the glass of brandy that was half empty before noon, or the name that was murmured once in what appeared to be a dream. A good valet sees everything and accounts for none of it, except in the private interior where his own observations live and where no one is invited. I am 61 years old. My hand is still steady and my memory is clear, and I intend to use both while I have them. The events of the year following His Grace's return from the campaign are the most consequential thing I have ever witnessed, and I believe they deserve to be written down by someone who was present for all of it. His Grace himself would likely object to this project, on the grounds that he has spent considerable effort over the past decade developing a robust and genuine opinion about privacy. Her Grace, as she has been for these 12 years, would be more sanguine about it. She has always had a pragmatist's relationship with the past. It happened, it was what it was, and there is no use in pretending it did not. That, I have come to understand, is simply the way she is built. So I will write it down. I will write it down as I saw it, which is to say from the particular perspective of a man who is never quite in the room but is never quite out of it either, who hears the silences between the spoken lines and observes the way a man stands at a window for 11 minutes and the way a woman sets down a cup. The story is about a scar and what grew from the acknowledgement of it, but that is not quite accurate either. The scar is where the story began, in the sense that a stone thrown into water is where the rings begin. It is the first cause, but the rings are what spread, and the rings are what matter. His Grace, Edmund Ashworth, 9th Duke of Ravenscroft, came home from the campaign in the 4th week of July with 3 things he had not possessed when he left. The first was a wound. A cavalry saber cut that began at the left corner of his jaw, crossed the cheekbone at a 45-degree angle, and ended just below the outer socket of his left eye. A fragment of shrapnel had also entered the tissue near the eye during the same engagement, and the regimental surgeons had debated, at some length and with less agreement than was comfortable, whether the greater risk lay in removing it or in leaving it. They had left it. His eye was intact. The tension in the flesh around it was not. The second thing he brought back was a silence. I do not mean the ordinary silence of a private man, which His Grace had always been. I mean a silence of a particular quality, dense, comprehensive, load-bearing, as though the air in whatever room he occupied was using all its available space for the silence and had none left for anything else. He had been a quiet man before the war. He had been even so alive to the world in ways that expressed themselves in small and specific moments. In the dry observation delivered to his friend Halcott when they dined, in the slight change of his posture when a subject engaged him, in the quality of attention he brought to a well-made thing, whether that thing was an estate account that balanced correctly or a piece of music played by someone who knew what they were doing. That aliveness was, after his return, absent, not masked, not suppressed. Absent, as though it had been a lamp that someone had taken away. The third thing he brought back was his brother's death. Captain the Honorable James Ashworth had followed his elder brother into the campaign with the particular stubbornness of a younger son who had watched his elder brother do everything first for 23 years, and had decided, approximately at age 17, that this particular adventure could not proceed without him. Edmund had argued against it. He had made the argument that James had a perfectly good life ahead of him that did not require the specific character-building and bone-breaking qualities of a military campaign. And James had replied with the cheerful confidence of a man who is 21 and has never been wrong about anything. And the argument had ended the way arguments between them always ended. Which is to say that James had done precisely what he intended to do from the beginning, and Edmund had been left in the position of either closing ranks behind him or abandoning him to his own devices, and had chosen, as he always chose in the end, to close ranks. James died 2 months after Edmund was sent home to recover from the wound. A fever, not a battle, which was the sort of detail that the campaign produced in quantity, and that I believe was, for His Grace, somehow more unbearable than a battlefield death would have been. A letter arrived in September. I set it on the breakfast table as I would any letter, and His Grace picked it up and read it, and set it face down with the same controlled expression that had been his face since July, and said, "You may inform the cook that I will not require luncheon today," and went upstairs, and did not come down until the following morning. He was, when he came down, precisely as composed as he had been the evening before. He asked for his correspondence and reviewed it. He wrote 3 replies. He met with Tolley about the harvest accounts and made 3 specific and sensible points about a discrepancy in the Northfield figures. He went for his morning walk. He did all of this as though nothing had happened, which is one of the things a duke's education is designed to produce, and which is among the least useful of its products. I pressed his coat and polished his boots and said nothing, because that is what he needed from me. I was, through all of this, worried. I had been worried since July in the steady, contained way I brought to everything, but the arrival of the September letter deepened it into something more specific. The worry I carry for His Grace is not a performing worry. I do not wring my hands or seek confidences or make observations out loud about the changes I am observing. It is simply a weight that I carry alongside the other weights of my position, and I attend to it as I attend to everything. By observing, by being where I am needed, and by making small, quiet adjustments that I do not announce. One of the adjustments I made in July, before his arrival home, was the removal of the largest mirrors from his dressing room and his private sitting room. I told Mrs. Hardcastle, who managed the house with the quiet authority of a woman who has earned it over 30 years, that they were being resilvered. She gave me the look she reserves for situations where she understands perfectly well what is happening and has decided that what is happening is correct and requires no further comment from her. She said nothing at all. The mirrors were removed. He noticed on the 2nd day. He did not ask for them to be returned, and I did not raise the subject, and the mirrors stayed elsewhere for 4 months, until a morning in November when he asked me, without particular preamble, to have them put back, and I did. I marked that morning as one kind of turning point. The turning point of the kind that actually mattered came earlier, in October, and from an unlikely direction. It came from Mrs. Hardcastle. She raised the subject on a Tuesday afternoon in my pantry, which is where she raised most subjects she wished to discuss with me, because the pantry was warm and private and contained good tea. She sat down with a cup and said without preliminary, "Mr. Pitsworth, I wonder if you have given recent thought to the question of our medical provisions." I considered this. I said, "We have the village physician and the Duke's surgeons in London at need. I had not thought they were insufficient." She said, "The village physician is 71, and his eyesight is not what it was." I consulted him last week about young Thomas in the stables, a hand injury that has been troubling the boy for a month, and I came away from the consultation feeling that we might benefit from more reliable local provision, particularly going into the winter months. She said this with a perfectly measured neutrality. I said, "What local provision did you have in mind?" She said, "There is a woman in the village, Miss Voss. Her father was the apothecary, old Voss. You will remember him. He died in the spring after a long illness. She managed the shop through his final illness and has continued to manage it since. The reports I have received are consistent. She is skilled, particularly in wound care. She is extremely reliable, and she is, by all accounts, not easily unsettled." She said the phrase, "not easily unsettled," with the same careful neutrality she had brought to the whole of it, and there was a pause of approximately 4 seconds in which we both looked at our tea. I said, "I will make some inquiries." She said, "I thought you might," and rose with her cup and went out. I spent the following week making the inquiries she had anticipated. What I assembled was a portrait of consistent and specific detail. Ilara Voss, 7 and 20, the only child of the late Gerhard Voss, who had come to England from the continent 4 decades ago with a German physician's training and a practical intelligence about what a rural English community needed from its medical provision. He had built a practice and a reputation and then a daughter, and he had educated the daughter with an attention that was, for the time and the circumstances, unusual. Bringing her into his work early, first as an observer, then as an assistant, then as something closer to a colleague, which was entirely irregular and which he had managed by simply doing it, and not pausing to ask whether it was regular. She had been, by the time of his final illness, the effective practitioner in the shop for 3 years. People came to see her rather than him, by the end, which he seemed to have found perfectly satisfactory. She had managed the transition from his death to her own proprietorship with a competence that had been universally noted, and then, in the manner of things noted in small communities, quietly accepted as simply the way things were now. There was some history with a broken engagement. The particulars were the kind that a small community knows in full and discusses in whispered half-sentences, and what I assembled from the half-sentences was this. A young man from a merchant family in the market town, an understanding between them that had been informal but real, and then a discovery on his part of a better prospect, and a conversation with her in which he had explained the situation with whatever combination of regret and self-justification such conversations produce. And that was that. She had been wounded by it in a way she had managed entirely privately, and had not permitted to define her subsequent behavior, though it had defined certain other people's expectations of her, in the particular way that such things do in places where everyone knows everyone's business. She had not remarried. She had opened her shop wider, taken on more patients, developed a reputation that grew steadily in the years since her father's death, and given no visible indication that the wound had done anything except, possibly, sharpen a particular quality of self-containment that had always been characteristic of her. I went to the shop on a Wednesday morning in late October. The morning was cold and damp with the particular chill of late autumn in this part of England, and the shop was warm with the heat of the stove in the back, and it smelled of dried herbs and something sharper underneath that I associated with preparations I could not name. It was an extraordinarily orderly shop for the volume of material it contained, with the particular order of a space managed by someone who knows precisely where everything is and why it is there. Miss Voss was at the work counter at the back when I came in, occupied with a mortar and pestle and a small ledger she was consulting with alternating attention. The bell above the door sounded, and she looked up, assessed me with a single quick glance that I felt was considerably more comprehensive than it appeared, and said, "Good morning. I'll be with you shortly," and went back to the mortar. She came to the counter when the task was complete and the ledger updated, perhaps 2 minutes, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has learned that interrupting a thing halfway through costs more than finishing it. She was of medium height, with dark brown hair dressed back from her face in a practical style that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with keeping hair out of the way while working. Her face was what I would call considered rather than striking. Good cheekbones, a jaw that suggested considerable composure, gray eyes that were direct and quick, and that I noticed immediately were the eyes of someone who was genuinely paying attention rather than performing attention. Her hands, at the counter, were steady and unsentimental. I explained who I was and what I was inquiring about. She listened with the complete, particular quality of attention that I have learned, over a life of observing people, to distinguish from the performance of attention. She was actually hearing what I said. When I had finished, she asked 3 questions, in order. What medical provision was the hall currently using? What was the specific nature of the gap that had prompted this inquiry? And what access she would have to the household's existing supply stores if she were to be engaged? I answered the first and third directly. For the second I said, with the careful honesty the situation required, His Grace returned from the campaign in July with a wound that has healed adequately. He has declined further medical attention since August. The household has some general concern about his well-being through the winter. She listened to this. She did not ask what the wound was. She said, "I would need to meet with His Grace before I could commit to any arrangement. I don't take on household commissions without first understanding what's actually needed." This was exactly the right response, and it was not the response I had expected, and I liked her for it at once. I said I would arrange the meeting. Arranging the meeting required, as I had anticipated, a certain amount of careful management. His Grace heard my proposal with the flat, controlled expression that had become his standard response to external propositions, and said, "We have a physician in London." I said, "Yes, Your Grace." This arrangement would be for more immediate local provision, particularly for the household staff through the winter months. He said, "Mrs. Harcastle manages the household's immediate needs." I said, "Mrs. Harcastle is excellent, and she has expressed concern about the reliability of the village physician, who is, as Your Grace is perhaps aware, elderly and experiencing difficulties with his vision." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he had understood the situation completely, and was deciding whether to accept it or continue to resist it on grounds he knew were not entirely sound. He said, "What is this woman's training?" I gave him the full account I had assembled. Her father's continental training, her 15 years of education and apprenticeship alongside him, the nature and breadth of her current practice. He listened. He said, "She is not a physician." I said, "No, Your Grace. She is, by consistent and specific report, more practically useful in the management of wounds than most physicians in this area." A pause. He looked at me with the expression I had come to know, the expression of a man who has understood precisely what is happening and is deciding whether to allow it. He said, "One meeting. I make no commitments." I said, "Of course, Your Grace." Miss Voss came to the hall on the Thursday following. She arrived exactly at 9, which I noted with approval, in her best dark coat over a plain, neat dress that was neither apologizing for itself nor pretending to be something it wasn't. She carried her leather medical bag. She came through the servants' entrance, and I met her there, and brought her to the small receiving room near the library, chosen deliberately, as it was warmer than the formal rooms and less likely to produce the kind of low-grade intimidation that makes people perform rather than simply be themselves. She sat with her bag on the floor beside her and her hands in her lap, and looked at the window, where the oak trees along the drive were releasing the last of their leaves in a pale autumn drizzle. She did not fidget. I have been in rooms with many people who were waiting for an audience with His Grace, and most of them fidgeted, with gloves, with papers, with the buttons of their coat. She did not. She had the quality of stillness I associate with very competent people. Not the stillness of passivity, but the stillness of someone who is completely present in the moment and is not spending any energy on anticipation. His Grace kept her waiting for 11 minutes. I do not know whether this was deliberate, or whether those 11 minutes were spent on the other side of the library door doing something similar to what he had done before stepping down from the carriage in July. Preparing, in the particular way of a man who has acquired something difficult to carry, and is working out how to carry it in public without it showing. When he came in as though he intended to make the meeting brief, formal, and conclusive. He was in his day coat, which I had pressed that morning, and his bearing was the controlled, courteous remove he had always adopted with strangers and had in recent months extended to everyone. The scar was precisely what it was visible in the morning light from the window, the pale pink ridge of it pulling the left side of his face into its slight, permanent tension, and I watched Miss Voss's face when he entered. She looked at him. She looked at his face with the direct, interested attention she had given me when I walked into her shop, actually seeing, not performing the effort of seeing, and not performing the effort of not seeing, which is equally a performance and equally obvious. She simply looked at him as a person. He said, "Miss Voss, I am Ravenscroft. Pitsworth tells me you manage the village apothecary." She stood, she said, "I do. And I understand from Mr. Pitsworth that you have a wound from the campaign that has given you some difficulty." He said, "My wound healed over the summer. There is no difficulty." She said, with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has long since learned not to argue about things that are not worth arguing about, "I'm glad to hear it. In that case, a household arrangement would principally be of service to your staff, which is a very reasonable thing to maintain in an establishment this size. The winter months tend to be hard on household staff. The cold affects hands and joints. The heavy work takes a toll on backs. I'd need to understand what supplies you already maintain, and what my access to them would be." She was not trying to reach him. She was simply being accurate about what she could offer and what she would need, in the pleasant, practical way of someone who has a service to provide and is accustomed to providing it clearly. He said, "What is your fee?" She named a figure. It was entirely reasonable, perhaps slightly below what she could have asked, and she stated it without apology or qualification. He said, "1 day a week initially. If the arrangement proves satisfactory, it may be extended." She said, "That suits me, provided I can arrange my shop schedule around it. I'd propose Thursdays." He said, "Thursdays, then." She said, "Thank you, Your Grace." He said, with a slight additional weight in his voice that indicated this was the point the conversation had been building toward. "Miss Voss, the arrangement is for the household's benefit. I do not require personal medical attention." She looked at him. There was a beat of silence that was not empty. It had a quality of hearing, as though she were genuinely receiving what he had said and considering it rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. She said, "Of course," and she picked up her bag and went out. She came every Thursday beginning in November, And she was, from the first, exactly what Mrs. Hardcastle had needed, and rather more than I had hoped. She arrived at 9, made her way through whoever in the household had accumulated something that needed attention, consulted with Mrs. Hardcastle about the supply stores, noted what needed replenishing, and generally did her work with the pleasant, efficient care that I had by then come to recognize as her natural register in everything. The staff liked her immediately. This matters more than it might seem in a great house. The staff's opinion of a new arrangement is formed early and held firmly, and when it is favorable, it creates a quality of ease in the house that is very difficult to achieve any other way. They liked her because she was direct, and because she was competent, and because she listened to what they said about their ailments rather than deciding in advance what the ailment must be. She treated young Thomas in the stables within her first 2 weeks of attendance, and within her first hour of examining his hand, she identified a fracture that had been healing at an angle, and she corrected it with a quick, sure technique that earned her his genuine and somewhat awed respect. Not performed gratitude, which Thomas dispensed rarely, but the specific respect of a young man who has encountered someone who knows what they are doing. His Grace did not see her during those first Thursday visits. He arranged, with a precision that I felt was somewhat more deliberate than mere coincidence required, to be at his desk or on the grounds, or in a meeting with Tolley on every Thursday morning she was in the house. I watched this arrangement with the patient attention that is my professional mode, and I said nothing about it, because it was his house and his choice, and because the important thing I have learned in 23 years is not the pace of progress but the direction. The direction changed on the 4th Thursday of November. One of the younger kitchen maids, a cheerful and somewhat careless girl named Bess, burned her arm on the stove that morning. The burn was not catastrophic. It would heal cleanly with good care and would not leave a mark. But it was serious enough that Mrs. Hardcastle sent for Miss Voss at 7:30 rather than waiting for the appointed hour. And Miss Voss arrived at 7:45 and was in the kitchen tending to Bess when His Grace, who had been awake since before 5 and walking the grounds since before 6, came in through the back passage that connected the morning room corridor to the kitchen wing. Looking for his early breakfast, he stopped in the doorway. Miss Voss was crouched beside the kitchen chair where Bess sat with her arm extended over a basin, and she was working on the burn with the particular quality of focused attention that I would come to understand over many months of observation was her default mode in any situation requiring skill. All of herself applied to the task, the rest of the room becoming background. She was speaking quietly to Bess as she worked, in the tone of someone who is both performing a technical task and helping another person through the experience of having the task performed on them. She said, "I know it's unpleasant. You're doing very well and you're going to be perfectly fine. Hold your arm just like this, don't move it, there we are." Bess was crying in the quiet, contained way of someone who is trying not to be too much trouble. Miss Voss was not telling her to stop crying. She was simply proceeding as though the crying were a reasonable and entirely expected background condition. She became aware a few seconds later of His Grace in the doorway. She looked up. She looked at him with the same direct, level attention she gave everything, not startled, not adjusting herself to the arrival of a duke, simply noting him with the same attentiveness she brought to everything. She said quite naturally, "Good morning, Your Grace. Could I ask you to step back a little? I need the air to circulate here, and a draft from the passage won't help." He stepped back into the passage without a word. She returned to Bess. He stood in the passage for perhaps 30 seconds, and then, quietly, he went away in the direction of the morning room. I followed at a discreet distance. I found him in the library 20 minutes later. He was standing at the window that looked out over the park, with his hands behind his back and his gaze on the middle distance. He was not holding a book. He was not looking at the correspondence on his desk. He said without turning, "Bess, is it serious?" I said, "Miss Voss believes the burn will heal cleanly with proper care. She has recommended the girl rest the arm for 2 days. He said, "See to it that she gets those days." A pause, he continued to look at the window. He said, "She did not look at the scar." He said it as a simple observation in the flat, quiet register of his recent months, not with any particular weight, just a fact that had been noted. I said, "No, Your Grace, she did not." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, in a register that was slightly different, more deliberate, more considered, "When she has finished with Bess, Ask her to come in here. I have some questions about the wound care she is using." I said, "Of course, Your Grace," and went to arrange it. Miss Voss came to the library at 9:30. She brought her bag, set it on the floor beside her chair, and sat with the settled readiness that I had begun to identify as one of her characteristic postures. Fully present, not performing anything, at ease with whatever the next thing was going to be. The fire was burning, and the morning light was thin and gray through the tall windows, and His Grace sat at his desk, and she sat in the chair across from it. And there was between them, I thought, an atmosphere that was different from the atmosphere of the receiving room a month ago, though I could not have said precisely how or why. He asked her about the compound she had used on Bess. She described it, the components, the rationale, the expected course of healing, the signs to watch for. She was precise without being pedantic, and she used technical language appropriately, accurately but not excessively, calibrated to the evident intelligence of the person across the desk from her. He listened with genuine interest. He asked questions that were not the questions of a man making polite conversation. They were the questions of someone who had been, as an officer responsible for injured men, attentive to the work of the surgeons in his care, and who had retained that attention and was applying it now. He asked about the mechanism of action of the primary compound, about the rate of healing she expected in a young woman of Bess's constitution, about the alternative she had mentioned and then set aside. She answered all of it directly and without simplifying, and the conversation had the quality of a real exchange of information between two people who were both genuinely interested in the subject. At some point, I cannot mark it precisely because I was in and out of the room for the fire and the tea and an upstairs question that required my attention, the conversation shifted, not abruptly, more like a river broadening as it approaches open ground, the same current but moving differently. He asked her about her father's practice. She told him about the older Voss, his continental training, his particular philosophy that observation was the primary tool of medicine, an elegant theory only its servant, his belief that looking carefully at the actual patient was more valuable than any abstract principle. She described this with the quality of someone who had genuinely loved and admired her teacher, and who was giving an account that was honest rather than sentimental. She spoke of his gifts and his limitations with the same level tone, which was a form of respect more truthful than any effusion. He, in turn, spoke of his regiment, not of the campaign itself. There was a quality of not yet about certain subjects, as though they were rooms with closed doors that he was prepared to acknowledge the existence of but not yet to open, but about the men. The texture of responsibility that comes from commanding people in conditions of genuine danger, the weight of decisions made on incomplete information, the specific quality of grief that belongs to loss that is not precisely your fault, but that is, inescapably, connected to choices you made. She listened to all of this with the full attention she brought to everything, and what I noticed, and I was paying close attention, as I always was that she did not do what most people did with him, which was to adjust the pitch and register of their response to account for his rank and his grief and his wound. She simply listened to him and responded to what he said, not to the circumstances surrounding what he said. It is a small thing. It is extremely rare. He said, at some point, "You did not look at the scar when you came into the library." She said, "I saw it." He said, "I know you saw it." She said, "What would looking at it have accomplished? I was looking at you." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Most people manage one or the other." "Not both." She considered this. She said, "I'm a practitioner. I look at what I need to look at for the purposes of the work. For everything else, I try to look at the actual person." He said, "That is a more careful distinction than most people trouble to make." She said, "I find it useful." He looked at her for a moment with the particular attention that I had been watching him give things for 23 years, quiet, specific, entirely present. He said, "Thursdays, Miss Voss, when you have finished with the household, you may come and give me a report of what you have found and what you intend to address, if it is not inconvenient." She said, "It is not inconvenient, Your Grace." That was the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the Thursday hours in the library expanded. She came at 9 and made her rounds and then came to the library, and the door closed, and an hour became 2 hours became, eventually, 3 or more. I know this because I maintained the fire and the tea and the coal scuttle. and because I know what I observed in the quality of his Grace's demeanor at lunch and in the evenings, and the two sets of observations together told a clear enough story. He began to read again, not the unmoving book open on the desk that I had been observing since July, but actually reading, actually moving through pages, leaving his place marked and returning to it, ordering books from London and finishing them in the time it used to take him to consider whether he wanted to start them. He began to take an interest in correspondence that was not purely necessary. A letter from a former colleague about agricultural improvements, a publication on natural philosophy, a query from the county society about whether he would consider a paper on estate drainage. He began to ask questions at dinner that had the quality of genuine curiosity rather than the automatic maintenance of a man performing the forms. He did not go out socially. He did not receive visitors. But the quality of the interior was changing, and I noticed it the way you notice the first difference in the light in February. Not a dramatic shift, not something you can point to on a specific afternoon and say, here, this is when it changed, but something cumulative and real and moving in only one direction. I will describe one Thursday in late November in some detail, because it contains a particular exchange that I have thought about many times since. She came at 9. She spent the morning with two members of the kitchen staff who had the kind of winter respiratory ailments that pass through a large household with the relentlessness of weather, and with the footman who had strained his shoulder carrying coal the previous week, and with Thomas, whose hand was progressing well and who had developed, I noticed, a habit of being in the vicinity of the stable yard around 9 on Thursdays. She spent time with Mrs. Harcastle reviewing the supply stores for the month and recommending 2 additions appropriate to the season. Then she came to the library, and the door closed. I brought tea at 10 and found them in the midst of a discussion that had clearly been underway for some time, about the question of whether the efficacy of a compound depended solely on its chemical action, or whether the quality of attention brought to the work, the state of mind of both the practitioner and the patient, had an effect that was measurable if difficult to measure. He was arguing from a position of genuine intellectual engagement, that the question was unanswerable with the current tools of natural philosophy, and therefore not useful to reason about. She was arguing with the patient directness of someone who has seen a great many things that natural philosophy has not yet developed vocabulary for, that it was precisely the unanswerable questions that were most worth asking, because they kept the practitioner honest about the limits of what she knew. I set down the tea and stoked the fire and went out. I heard him say, as I closed the door, "That is a more optimistic position than I expected from you." And I heard her say, "I'm not an optimist generally. I'm an optimist about medicine specifically." I stood in the passage for a moment because there was something in his voice during that exchange that had been absent since July, an engagement with the conversation that was not merely polite. It was the quality his voice had when he was actually interested in something, not managing interest, not producing the appearance of it, but genuinely having it. I went about my business and thought about what I had heard and was grateful. The first Thursday of December she arrived with, in addition to her usual bag, a small, carefully sealed glass bottle and a single page of notes in her precise, practical hand. She set the bottle on his desk with the care she gave fragile things. She said, "I have been working on something. I want to be precise with you about what it is and what it isn't before we discuss whether to use it." He looked at the bottle. He said, "Tell me." She told him. A compound she had been developing over several months, derived from components that had individually shown some effect on scar tissue in her reading and her limited practice, combined in a proportion that was her own hypothesis about optimal efficacy rather than anything she could claim certainty about. She had used variations of the individual components in 2 previous cases, both with less severe scarring than his, and had seen positive results in terms of the tightening effect on the surrounding skin. She could not promise similar results in his case, and she was not going to. She thought it was worth trying if he was willing. He said, "What are the risks?" She said, "Skin irritation is the primary risk. I have formulated it to minimize that, but it's possible. If you experience significant irritation, we would stop immediately." A pause. "There is no risk to the eye. I have been careful about that." He said, "How did you know to be careful about that?" She said, without particular emphasis, "Because it was the thing I would be most concerned about if I were you." He looked at her. He said after a moment, "May I see the notes?" She passed him the page. He read it with the focused, self-forgetting attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him. A quality I had always been able to recognize in him, a specific quality of stillness that meant the reading was real, and looked up. He said, "The second component, you've used it in a different application than this." She said, "Yes, it's primarily a wound-healing agent in general use. The scar tissue application is my hypothesis, derived from the mechanism rather than from established practice." He said, "Walk me through the reasoning." She did. She sat across from him and explained the logic of the formulation with the clarity of someone who thinks carefully about things and has learned to make the thinking visible, not for the purpose of impressing, but for the purpose of being understood. He listened and asked questions, and she answered the questions and occasionally said she didn't know, with the confidence of someone who has made peace with the limits of her knowledge and finds honesty about them more professionally useful than any pretense. At the end, she said, "Shall I leave it with you to consider?" He said, "No, I would like to try it." She said, "Today?" He said, "If you are prepared." She said, "I am." She brought her chair around the desk to the left side, to the side where the scar was, where the December light caught the ridge of it in the pale morning gray. She came around with the professional matter-of-factness of someone who has been in many sick rooms and has a clear task to perform, and she set the bottle and her materials on the corner of the desk and looked at him with the quiet, attentive expression that was her way of asking permission, without making the asking into something that required managing. He held himself very still. She said, "I need to apply this with a specific pressure and technique. The technique matters as much as the compound. Is that all right?" He said, "Yes." She opened the bottle. The scent that rose from it was clean and faintly astringent, something like pine resin, and something lighter underneath that I could not name from my position near the door, which I had arranged to provide me with sufficient view to observe without being observed. She worked with the deliberateness of someone performing a precise technical task, her attention on the tissue, her touch. I could see this clearly enough, specific rather than tentative, confident rather than apologetic. He sat very still for the duration of it. The application took perhaps 15 minutes. She described what she was doing as she did it, in the quiet, informative murmur she used when working on a patient who was alert and present. Not because explanation was necessary, but because she understood, I think, that explanation is a form of company in an otherwise solitary experience. When it was done, she stepped back and regarded the result with professional assessment. She said, "The compound needs about 20 minutes to absorb before you should move around normally. Some mild tightening is expected. If you experience anything more than mild, tell me immediately." He said, "I will." She began to pack her materials. She said, "The effects, if there are any, will take weeks to become apparent. I want to manage your expectations honestly. I do not know what the result will be. I think the formulation is sound, but I am not certain." He said, "I appreciate you saying so." She said, "You are being very patient about the uncertainty." He said, "I have been learning to be." She paused very briefly. She said, "That is a hard thing to learn." He said, "Yes." There was a quality to the silence that followed, 4 seconds, perhaps 5, that I recognized but did not name because it was not yet time to name it. She came every Thursday. She brought the compound and she applied it and she sat across from him for the hours after. And the things they talked about ranged widely and freely in the way of people who have run out of obligatory topics and have reached the territory of things they actually want to discuss. Her work, a case she was puzzling over in the village, a natural philosophy text he had been reading, the drainage problem in the North Field that had been exercising him since the summer, a question of history that occupied him with the particular intensity of questions connected to things he had seen. He talked gradually about James. This happened over many Thursdays, in the sidelong way that the most important things generally happened in those hours. Incidentally, in the middle of something else, as though the significant thing were traveling alongside whatever was nominally the subject of conversation. He spoke first of James in the context of her asking whether he had other family, and he answered briefly, a younger brother, dead since September, and she did not respond with the tonal shift that people adopted when informed of a death, The particular shift that he had told me once, in one of the dry and indirect ways he acknowledged things he would not say outright, was the response he found most difficult to manage. She said, after a brief pause, "I am sorry." That must have been a great deal to carry in the same year as the wound. He said, "Yes, it was." They went on to the next subject. She gave him the room to have said it without the saying becoming something he had to manage, which I noted as the specific and unusual quality it was. Over the following weeks, James emerged more fully. His temperament, which was louder and quicker than Edmund's in every dimension. His absolute certainty about everything he had not yet been wrong about. The specific, irresistible quality of his laugh. The argument before the campaign, which Edmund had lost in the way, he always lost arguments with James, and which he had not been able to think about since September without a kind of ache that was more complex than simple grief, that contained the specific pain of something that cannot be redone differently. She listened to all of it, and she asked the questions that kept the conversation moving without directing it where she thought it should go, and she did not perform sympathy or redirect toward the practical or make the grief into something she was managing on his behalf. She simply sat with him in whatever the conversation was, which is a harder thing than it appears, and rarer. On the third Thursday of December, she said, during the application of the compound, "The lateral movement has improved." He said, "I've noticed." She said, "Not dramatically yet, but measurably, the tissue is responding." He said, "I believe you." She said, "You don't have to believe me on faith. I can demonstrate the change against the baseline we established when we started." He said after a pause, "Not yet, but tell me if it continues." She said, "It will." She said it with the quiet confidence of someone who is telling you what they actually believe, based on what they are actually seeing, not performing confidence in the hope that it will be consoling. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to people simply believing, without qualification or careful hedging, that things will go well for him, and who has discovered that he does not know how to receive that kind of certainty gracefully. He said, "You are very certain." She said, "I'm certain about what I can see. The tissue is responding. The rest follows from that." A pause. "You are not accustomed to people being certain on your behalf." He said, "Not in recent months." She said, "Well, I am." And she returned to the work. December passed into January, and January brought the particular intimacy of warm rooms in the middle of winter, when the world outside is dark and cold, and the fire inside makes everything close and specific and particular to itself. On the first Thursday of the new year, she arrived at 9, and I brought her through to the library rather than the receiving room, because His Grace had indicated the previous week that he preferred this arrangement. There was a second cup on the breakfast tray. She set her bag down and looked at the tray, and then at His Grace, who was at his desk and who had about him the slightly particular quality of a man who is waiting to see whether a thing has been noticed in the way he intended. She said, "Good morning." He said, "Good morning, tea." She said, "Thank you." She sat, he poured, the morning began. I thought about that second cup for some time afterward. A cup of tea is a small thing, but I have spent more than 30 years in great houses, and I have observed the ways in which people of rank communicate things they cannot say directly, and a second cup on a breakfast tray is not a small thing. It is the sign of someone who has, at some point between the previous Thursday and this one, thought she will want tea when she arrives. And in that thinking has placed her in the future of the morning, in the space of his own time and table, in a way that is quiet and specific and entirely deliberate. In February, she told him about the engagement. I know this because she came out of the library that Thursday with a quality to her composure I had not seen before, not distressed, but lighter, the way a room feels when a window has been opened after a long time closed. And she said in the passage, "Mr. Pitsworth, may I trouble you for a moment?" We sat in the small receiving room, and she told me what she had told him. She told it briefly and without drama, with the clean, factual tone she used for difficult subjects. The young man, the arrangement between the families, the conversation in which he had explained that he had found a better prospect. She said, "I told His Grace because he said something about being seen in a way that reduces you to a single thing, and I wanted him to understand that I knew something about that from the other direction." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said, 'I see you, Miss Voss, not the thing they reduced you to.'" She looked at the window for a moment, Then she said, "He meant it. You can tell when a person means something. It's in the way the voice sits with what it's saying." She gathered herself, picked up her bag, said, "I'll see myself out. Good morning, Mr. Pitsworth," and went out into the February cold. I sat in the small receiving room and thought about many things. I thought about a young man of 17 who had ridden horses at speeds no reasonable person would have countenanced because no one had been paying attention to the person behind the air. I thought about a girl of 27 who had been making herself smaller for years in the hope that a smaller size might fit somewhere. I thought about the particular grace of two people who had each been taught, by difficult and unkind experience, to take up less room than they deserved, finding in each other someone who refused to do the diminishing. March. The compound had been in use for 4 months. The results were visible even to me, which I take as a meaningful threshold. The tightening that had been the principal physical complaint, the restricted movement when he turned his head, the tension in the tissue, had reduced substantially. The scar itself was what it was and would remain. She had been clear about that from the first conversation. But the thing the scar was doing to the surrounding tissue had changed, in the same gradual, cumulative way that everything of significance was changing at Ravenscroft Hall. She noted the change on a Thursday in March with the particular, genuine satisfaction of a practitioner whose hypothesis has been validated. She said, "The lateral movement has improved by approximately a third in the past 6 weeks." He said, "I know. I can feel the difference." She said, "The tightening will continue to ease. There is a natural plateau that I want to be honest with you about. Beyond a certain point, further improvement will be slow. But you are well past the halfway point in terms of what we can reasonably expect." He said, "You look pleased." She said, "I am." He said, "Not about being right, about something else." She was quiet for a beat. She said, "Yes, about something else." He said, "So am I." There was a pause that had a specific quality to it. The quality of a room that is exactly the right temperature, neither too warm nor cold, and in which everything is as it should be. He said, after a moment, "I have been thinking about something." She waited in the way she waited for everything, entirely present without pressing or retreating. He said, "I am aware that our arrangement is, by its nature, professional. I have been treating it as more than that on my side for some time. I have not said so because I was not certain, because I have been uncertain whether the offer." He stopped. This was unusual. His Grace was not a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. He said more directly, "I would like to see you outside of the household arrangement, more frequently. I would like to know you in a context that is not only this one." She said, "What would that look like?" He said, "A walk perhaps. The grounds are very fine in spring. Or more Thursdays in a different capacity. Or simply more of what this is, openly, rather than." She said, "I think you should say what you mean." He said, "I mean that I have come to value your company very greatly, and I would like more of it, and I am aware of the difference in our positions, and I do not want to place you in a situation that is uncomfortable. But I also cannot continue indefinitely in an arrangement that has become, for me, considerably more than professional without telling you that it has." She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "You are very careful with words." He said, "I have had to be." She said, "So have I." A pause. She said, "I would like to be clear about what I am agreeing to before I agree to it. I have learned to be careful about that." He said, "What would you like to be clear about?" She said, "Whether this is a direction or only a moment. I am not asking for a declaration. I am asking whether this is something that is going somewhere." He said without hesitation, "It is a direction." She looked at him. He looked back. The March light was beginning to have the quality that March light gets in this part of England when the season is genuinely turning, something warmer and more horizontal in it, something that catches the dust motes and makes them visible, and they sat in it with the ease of people who are past the awkwardness of being honest with each other. She said, "Then yes." He said, "I will arrange a walk. Saturday, if it is fine." She said, "Saturday." He said, "Miss Voss." She looked at him. He said, in private, "My name is Edmund." She said, "Edmund." Just like that, with the directness that was entirely her own. Not a performance of the intimacy, just the word. He said, "Thank you." She said, with the slight dryness that was among the finest of her qualities, "You're welcome." I was in the passage. I permitted myself, alone in the corridor, a smile of approximately 4 seconds duration, which was exactly as long as I could justify, and then I gathered myself and went to see about the afternoon. April. The Saturday walks began and extended to Saturdays and Tuesdays, and eventually to any day the weather permitted and their schedules allowed. I attended at the distance I had determined through careful calibration was correct, close enough to maintain the proprieties the county would eventually assess, far enough that the conversation between them was their own. He showed her the estate. Not as an act of display, he had never been a man who displayed his possessions for the purpose of impressing, but as a man who had a deep, genuine relationship with his land and who was, for the first time in a very long time, interested in sharing it. He showed her the Northfield drainage problem that had been troubling him since autumn, and she listened, and then walked the field edge with the purposeful stride she brought to everything and said, "The angle of the ground is encouraging pooling here, and here the drain should be deeper and repositioned by about 3 feet. There is a system the village has been using in the low-lying meadows near the mill that I think would transfer well." He looked at her, he said, "You know the village drainage system." She said, "I have been observing it for 2 years. There is a correlation between waterlogged ground and certain respiratory ailments in the spring that I have been investigating. It required understanding where the water actually goes." A pause. He said, "Tolly will want to speak with you." She said, "I'm happy to speak with him." They met with Tolly the following week. Tolly received this arrangement with the mild bewilderment of a practical man confronting a situation outside his experience, and then, when he had heard what she had to say, with the dawning recognition of a practical man who has just encountered a good idea regardless of its source. He implemented her suggestions over the following month. The Northfield was markedly improved by July. I note this in passing as a small but specific example of the kind of thing that happened in her proximity. Improvements, quiet and practical, in places where improvement had been needed and had not come from the expected directions. He began accompanying her on some of her Thursday morning rounds. Not intruding on the medical work, he had a clear sense of what was her professional space and what was his, but present, aware, occasionally noting something about a staff member's general condition with an accuracy that she received with the same attentiveness she gave everything. He learned the progress of the cases she was managing and remembered it week to week, asking about Bess's burn and the footman's shoulder and old Jenkins in the garden with his knee. And these questions, asked quietly and without ceremony, had an effect on the household that I can only describe as a gradual increase in the quality of the warmth in it. He began to come to the stables in the mornings. He had been riding since before dawn since his return. The early rides were part of his private management of himself. But he began to do it less furtively, to linger in the yard afterward, to exchange a word with Thomas, and then to receive Thomas's report on the horses with the genuine interest of someone who had always cared about the horses and had simply been too contracted inward to express it. In April, for the first time since July, he replied positively to a social invitation. It was a dinner at Halcott's, his oldest friend, who had been extending invitations since September and who had, by April, resigned himself to waiting with the patient stubbornness of a man who has known someone for 30 years, and has decided that 30 years gives him sufficient credit to keep asking. His Grace accepted with a note that was, by his own subsequent account, delivered in the dry, slightly rueful register he used when acknowledging his own behavior from outside, approximately 40% less gracious than he had intended, because the first draft had been too formal and the second too elaborate, and the third was what he sent. He came back at 11. I was still up, as I generally was when he was out in the evenings, and he came into the hall and handed me his coat and said, "Halcott is well. His wife is well. Their children are, by their account, flourishing. The food was adequate." A pause, during which I waited. He said, "It was not as difficult as I had expected." I said, "I am glad to hear it, Your Grace." He said, and went upstairs, and there was something about the quality of the going upstairs that was different, lighter somehow, less weighted. May. The Dowager Duchess arrived in May. She came without warning, which was her preference in situations where warning would give her quarry time to prepare his position. And she arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 trunks, her lady's maid, and the particular forward momentum of a small woman who has been patient for 10 months and has decided that patience has outlasted its utility. His Grace met her in the hall with the expression of a man who had been expecting a siege and was calculating the terms of his position. She embraced him with the ferocity of a mother who has not seen her son properly since before the campaign, and she stood back and looked at his face with the direct attention of a woman who is going to look at exactly what she is going to look at, and is not going to perform any careful avoidance for anyone's benefit. She said, "You look better than I feared." He said, "You might have given me notice." She said, "You might have replied to my letters with something other than elaborate reasons why a visit was inconvenient." He said, "I replied in full to every letter." She said, "You replied in full to every letter with 12 different varieties of the same answer." She waved this aside. "I am here. I am staying a week. You may arrange your feelings about it." He looked at her for a moment, and I thought I saw something in his face that was not quite relief, but was in its neighborhood. The thing that happens when a person you have been keeping at a deliberate distance actually arrives, and you find that the distance was more costly than the arrival. He showed her to her rooms. They dined together that evening. Mrs. Harcastle, who served the dinner, reported to me afterward that the conversation had been very direct on the Dowager's part and very controlled on His Grace's part, and that by the end of the meal something had been arrived at between them that she could not quite characterize, but that had left them sitting over their wine in a quiet that was different in quality from the quiet of constraint. She was awake and about when Miss Voss arrived on the Thursday. I had informed His Grace that the Dowager was in residence. He had considered this for a moment and said, with the precision of someone who had thought about it before I raised it, "Miss Voss comes at 9. Nothing changes." I had then gone to Miss Voss at the servants' entrance and told her. She absorbed it with a brief, considering pause and said, "Should I come back next week?" I said, "His Grace has made no such instruction." She said, "All right," and came in. She made her rounds until 10 and then came to the library. The door closed. I took my position in the passage. The Dowager found me at 20 past 10 and said, "The young woman I've just seen making her way through the house." I said, "Miss Voss, Your Grace, the household's apothecary." She said, "I've been informed she spends considerable time in the library on Thursdays." I said, "She gives His Grace a report of the household's medical matters, Your Grace." She said, "I'm sure she does," in a tone that was entirely neutral and contained a great deal of information. She went into the library. I know this because I heard the door open and the brief recalibration of silence that followed, and then, some minutes later, 3 people in conversation. She stayed 45 minutes. When she came out, she found me and said, without preamble, "That young woman." I said, "Yes, Your Grace." She said, "She speaks to him as though he is a person." I said carefully, "Yes, Your Grace, she does." She said, "He is not of her rank, and she is not of his, and she appears to be, nevertheless, precisely what he has needed." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He looks as I have not seen him look since before his father died, since before the weight of the title was fully on him, since there was still something easier in him." I said nothing, because nothing was the correct response. She said, "I will not interfere. I want to be clear about that." A pause, in which she appeared to be making a genuine commitment regarding future behavior. "I will observe. I will form my opinions, and I will not interfere." I said, "That seems very wise, Your Grace." She looked at me sharply. She said, "I can see you approving of me, Pitsworth. You may stop." She went back to the drawing room. She stayed the week, and in that week she was civil to Miss Voss, which was the Dowager's version of warmth in new acquaintances, and she asked her 3 sharp, genuine questions about her work and received the answers they deserved. And on the Thursday before her departure she pressed Miss Voss's hand and said, "I have this from Miss Voss directly. He is not easy. But he is worth it." Miss Voss said, with the dry precision that was entirely her own, "I have not found him difficult, Your Grace." The Dowager said, with a quality that in another person might have been called a twinkle, "Then you haven't met the difficult version yet. Although I suppose the difficult version went to the campaign, so perhaps you have had the better of the deal." She left on Saturday. His Grace saw her to her carriage. They stood together for a moment at the foot of the steps with the quality of 2 people who have, over the course of a week, said some difficult things, and arrived at something more settled than when they began. And she put her hand on his arm and said something brief and quiet that I was not close enough to hear. And he nodded, and she got into the carriage and it drove away. He stood for a moment at the top of the steps, and then he turned and came inside, and he said, passing me in the hall, "My mother is improving with age." I said, "I believe that is what some people say about wine, Your Grace." He gave me the look he reserved for that exact species of comment, the look that contained the compressed acknowledgement of something he would have found amusing if he permitted himself to find things amusing without qualification, and went to the library. June. The County Charity Assembly was in the first week of June. The cause was the village school, which had lost its roof to a fire in January and had been conducting lessons in the church vestry with the patient improvisation of people who have no other option. The invitation to Ravenscroft Hall arrived in late April and sat on His Grace's desk for approximately 3 weeks without any visible action. I observed the letter. I said nothing. Miss Voss mentioned it on a Thursday morning in late May, during the application of the compound. She said, in the matter-of-fact way she had of introducing important things, "The school assembly is in 2 weeks." He said, "I know." She said, "I've been asked to manage the first aid station." He said, She continued the application. She said, "Will you attend?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I have been considering it." She said, with the directness he had told her he valued most about her, "I think you should. Not because there is an obligation, and not because the county's opinion matters more than your own, but because I think the anticipation is worse than the experience will be, and because you have been in this house for almost a year, and I think that is long enough." He said, "In this house?" She said, "In this particular arrangement with the outside world." He said, "You speak as though you have direct experience of that." She said, "I went back to the village the week after the engagement was broken. I had been inside for 4 days and I was going to lose my mind with it. My father was still alive then. He came with me. We walked down the main street at noon on a market day. People looked. A few said something kind in the particular way that is actually unkind, that reminds you of the thing they are pretending to sympathize with. I bought a measure of oats and went home, and then it was done. The next time I walked down that street, I was simply a person walking down a street." He said, after a moment, "Your father went with you." She said, "He held my elbow." And then she pressed her hand, briefly and without self-consciousness, against his arm, against the wool of his coat, just lightly, just for a moment. "Like that," she said. The silence that followed had a particular quality. The quality of the first time that something is very simple and very clear between two people who have not been simple and clear about it before. He said, "Would you go with me?" "To the assembly." She said, "In what capacity?" He said, "As my companion." A pause. "I am aware of what that implies in this county, among people who have been watching this house since July. I am not asking carelessly." She said, "No, you're not." He said, "I am asking because I would like you there, and because I would like to be clear about the direction this is going, publicly as well as privately." She said, "Edmund." He looked at her. She said, "Do you see me? Not what I represent, not the public signal of the arrangement, me." He said, without a moment's hesitation, "Yes, I see you. I have told you that and I have meant it every time." She looked at him. She said, "Then yes. I will go with you." He said, "Good." She said, "I will need a different dress." He said, "I will speak to Mrs. Hardcastle." She said, with the slight dryness that was among the things I most admired about her, "You'll speak to your mother, actually. She wrote to me last week." He stared at her. He said, "My mother wrote to you." She said, "She sent the name of her dressmaker." He closed his eyes briefly. He said, "She said she would not interfere." Miss Voss said, "She specified that she was not interfering. She was providing relevant information." He said, "That distinction is one she has always been very particular about." She said, with the slight curve of expression that was, for her, a genuine smile, "I found it useful, actually." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he laughed, the same laugh I had not heard since before the campaign, low, dry, genuine, the laugh of a man who has been surprised into it by something actually amusing. The library was very quiet, and the laugh was particular in the quiet. and I stood in the passage with the door between us and thought that some years of service, some particular years, produce moments that make the whole of it worthwhile. The assembly was on the 7th of June. He wore his best coat, and he arrived at the village hall with Miss Voss beside him, in a dress from the dowager's dressmaker that was exactly right in every particular, good without pretension, suited to the occasion without diminishing her, and exactly what she was. She wore her grandmother's small pearl earrings. Her hair was up. She looked precisely like herself. They walked in. I was there at the far end of the room, near the refreshment table, in my capacity as an observer of everything. I watched what happened. People looked, of course they looked. He was the Duke of Ravenscroft, not seen in public since July, and he came in with a village apothecary beside him, and the scar was visible in the candlelight, and of course people looked. He walked in as though the looking were entirely irrelevant to him. He walked in with the same upright, precise carriage he had always had, and he was present in the room in a way he had not been present anywhere in 11 months, not defended, not contracted, simply there, in the same room as everyone else, not performing anything, just present. People looked, and then they looked away because there were other things to look at. And then people came to speak to him, carefully and correctly, and he spoke to them with the controlled courtesy that had always been his public manner, and that contained, I thought, more warmth than it had before the war. He introduced her. He said to each person, "May I introduce Miss Voss, the village apothecary, who has been invaluable to us at Ravenscroft Hall this past year." He said it consistently and without variation, and the word invaluable sat in each of those introductions like a stone in water, producing rings that spread considerably farther than the stone itself. She gave her small, precise inclination of the head and spoke to people with the pleasant, direct ease that was her natural manner. Several of the people he introduced her to already knew her, and there was a quality to those encounters that was warm and unforced, the warmth of a woman who is genuinely known and genuinely respected in her own community, appearing now in a context that acknowledged both. They danced once, a country dance, informal and easy, the sort that does not require perfect form. They moved through it with the attentive care of two people who are paying enough attention to each other to make up an attentiveness for whatever they lack in practice. And during the dance, he said something to her that I could not hear from my position, and the left corner of her mouth moved into the expression I knew well, genuine amusement. They left before the assembly ended. He held the door. She walked through. He came after her, and they stepped out into the June evening, and neither of them looked back at the room they were leaving. July. He went to the shop on a Saturday morning in July. He walked the 1.5 miles to the village with the stride of someone who has decided on a thing and is going to do it, and he arrived at the apothecary at 10:30, and he went in. He came back at noon. He came through the front door and handed me his hat and his gloves and said, with the controlled, particular manner of a man who has done something entirely deliberate and intends to be clear that it was deliberate, "I have asked Miss Voss to marry me. She has accepted. You may inform Mrs. Hardcastle." I said, "Congratulations, Your Grace." He looked at me with the expression that, over the past year, had replaced the flat, controlled blankness of the first months. More alive, slightly self-aware, not quite permitting amusement, but not refusing it either. He said, "You are not surprised." I said, "It has been an extraordinary year, Your Grace." He said, "Yes," a pause. "It has been a very good year, Pitsworth." He went upstairs. I went to find Mrs. Hardcastle, who was in the linen room, and told her. She put down the sheet she was folding and turned to face me with the expression of a woman who has been correct about something for a very long time and has just received official confirmation. She said, "Well." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'll speak to cook," and went briskly out, and I stood in the linen room and thought about a Tuesday afternoon in October and a cup of tea and a suggestion made in the mildest possible voice. And I thought that some people are right about things more often than they are given credit for, and that Mrs. Hardcastle was one of them. September. The wedding was on the 14th, a Saturday. The day was fine, the particular fine of a September day when summer has not quite given way to autumn, the light warm and golden and the air clear. Mrs. Hardcastle had organized every detail of the reception and the household arrangements with the focused efficiency of a woman who has 30 years of experience and a great deal of personal investment in the outcome. The hall had been dressed without excess and with very good taste, which was Mrs. Harcastle's mode in all things. The dowager came down from Bath with a party of her closest friends, which in practice meant 3 women who had been her particular companions since youth and who were perfectly suited to the occasion. Observant, discreet, and in possession of opinions that they expressed to each other rather than to anyone who might find them inconvenient. She arrived on Thursday and embraced her son in the hall with the particular ferocity she reserved for moments of genuine emotion she was not going to acknowledge as such, and stood back and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time to see something specific, and is now seeing it. She said, "You look like yourself." He said, "I don't know what that means." She said, "Yes, you do." She released him. "Where is she?" He said, "In the village." She said, "I shall call on her tomorrow morning." He said, "She knows." She said, "Of course she knows. I wrote to her." He said, "You were not going to interfere." She said, "I am not interfering. I am calling on my future daughter-in-law." He looked at her for a moment and then said, with the dry precision she had given him, "There is no distinction between those things." She patted his arm. She said, "Don't be clever. It doesn't flatter you at the moment." She paused. "You look like your father." He was quiet. She said more gently, "That is not a bad thing. It is a very good thing." She went upstairs. The county came to the wedding. The village came. The people of Ravenscroft, who had been watching the hall since the previous July, came with the specific quality of attendance that belongs to the witnessing of something earned. Not the attendance of spectacle, but the attendance of people who understand the significance of what they are seeing, because they have watched the work that made it possible. Miss Voss had no family near except her father's sister from Herefordshire, a small, forthright woman named Mrs. Portman, who arrived on Thursday with a carpet bag and the warm practicality of someone who has come a long way for a good reason and intends to be fully equal to the occasion. She embraced her niece in the hallway of the inn and held her for a long moment with the completeness of an embrace that belongs to someone who has known you all your life and is entirely on your side, and then held her at arm's length and looked at her and said, "Well, are you happy?" Miss Voss said, "I am." Mrs. Portman said, "Good, then everything else is detail." She was entirely correct, as it turned out. Miss Voss came down the aisle in a dress that was exactly right. Mrs. Harcastle's judgment, refined by the dowager's dressmaker, had produced something beautiful without being showy, period appropriate without being merely conventional, exactly suited to the woman wearing it. Her hair was up. Her grandmother's pearls were at her ears. Mrs. Portman walked beside her, weeping freely and without self-consciousness from approximately the moment the church doors were opened, which I found entirely appropriate to the occasion. He stood at the altar and watched her come. I have watched Edmund Ashworth look at many things in 23 years. I have seen him look at the estate in all its seasons and conditions, at the faces of people who mattered to him and of people who threatened him, at the correspondence that changed the direction of his days, and at landscapes that gave him, in better years, what I can only call quiet. I have not, in any of those 23 years, seen him look at anything the way he looked at her coming down that aisle in September. It was the look of a man who has spent a year learning something he did not previously know how to do. A hard thing. A thing that required more courage than the campaign had required, in the specific way that the quiet personal things require a different and harder courage than the public ones. And who has arrived, at the end of that year, at the extraordinary specific relief of the thing resolving into its simplest form. The learning had been difficult, and the resolution was simple, and the look on his face held both things at once. The memory of the difficulty and the full and present fact of the resolution, and between them something that I will not try to name, because to name it would make it smaller than it was. She reached him, she stood beside him. She looked up at him with the gray eyes and the level, settling attention that was the most entirely herself thing about her. And there was between them, for the moment before the vicar began, a silence that was not empty. It was full of everything that had happened in the library on Thursday mornings, full of second cups of tea, and compound applied by careful hands and conversations about natural philosophy and walks along the North Field and a laugh I had not heard for more than a year, full of the particular and specific miracle of 2 people who had each been reduced to a single defining thing. A scar, an abandoned girl, a feared duke, a village apothecary who was not quite enough for someone. Finding in each other the relief of someone who refused to reduce them. The vicar began. When the ring went on her finger, she looked at it for a moment. An old ring, dark gold. A family ring that had been Edmund's grandmother's and was neither showy nor plain, but simply right. And then she looked up at him, and what was in her face was the same thing that was in his, the peace of having been fully seen. Afterward, in the churchyard, in the September sunshine, they stood together while the county and the village flowed around them with the particular warmth of people who are genuinely pleased. Halcott shook his hand and said something blunt and warm that made his grace smile. Mrs. Portman kissed both their cheeks and went to find the refreshments. The dowager stood to one side with her particular friends and said something I could not hear, but that made all three of them turn briefly in the same direction and then away with expressions of agreement. I stood at the edge of the churchyard and watched all of it. I thought about July and about the carriage arriving and about the 11 minutes he had stood outside his own door and about the quality of the silence in the house that first week, so heavy there was no room in it for anything else. I thought about October and a pantry and a cup of tea and Mrs. Harcastle saying, with perfect, precise mildness, that there was a woman in the village worth considering. I thought about November and the library door and a question about wound care that lasted an hour and a half in a second cup, waiting on the breakfast tray in January. I thought about March and a direction stated without hesitation. I thought about all of it, and I thought about the year that had followed, and about the years that would come after, and about what I had been privileged to witness. He had come home with a scar and a silence and a grief, and he had sat for months in a house with the mirrors removed because he could not yet look at himself in them. And she had come on a Thursday morning in November, and she had looked at him. Not at the scar, not away from the scar, at him. At the person who lived behind it and inside it, and who had been, for months, invisible to everyone, including himself. And he had looked at her in return. That is what happened. I have set it down as carefully as I can, from the position of a man who was never quite in the room and never quite out of it, who watched the whole of it with the attention of someone who understood, even as it was happening, that what he was witnessing was the most important thing he would ever witness. Some years after the September wedding, when the hall had settled into the warmth that belongs to a house where something permanent has taken hold, a warmth that comes from the inside of the rooms rather than from their fires and their furnishings, that is different in quality from comfort, that is closer to the quality of a place where the people in it are glad to be in it. His youngest daughter came to find me in my pantry on a Thursday morning. She was 5 years old. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's particular, focused quality of attention to things that interested her, and she climbed onto the stool across from mine with the unself-conscious certainty of a child who has never been made to feel that her presence requires justification. And she said, with the directness that she had apparently inherited complete and undiluted from both her parents simultaneously, "Pitsworth, what is that mark on Papa's face?" I considered how to answer this for a moment. I said, "It is a mark he brought home from a difficult time, and it is part of who he is." She considered this in turn, with the focused attentiveness that was entirely her father's and the practical turn of mind that was entirely her mother's. She said, "Mama kisses it." I said, "Yes, she does." She said, with the perfect, satisfied completeness of a 5-year-old who has reasoned a thing through and found it sound, "Because she loves it." I said, "Because she loves him." She said, "Oh," a pause, "that is the same thing." I looked at her. She looked back at me with her mother's gray eyes and the steadiness that was both of theirs, and I thought, yes, that is precisely right. That is exactly the same thing. That is the whole of it. She slid off the stool and went out into the hall, and I heard her small, certain feet on the stairs, and then I heard her voice above calling for her mother, and then her mother's voice answering from somewhere in the house, warm and clear and entirely unhurried. And then the sound of a door opening and the quick rush of small feet finding what they had been looking for. I sat in my pantry with my hands folded, and I listened to the sounds of the house around me. The warmth of the hall in the middle of a morning, the small ordinary sounds of people going about their days in a place where they were glad to be. And I thought that in 23 years, and in all the years since, I had never been more certain that anything was as it should be. I have been right in my career about most of the important things. I was right about this. I have been asked on more than one occasion by people who know me well enough to ask why I have never taken a position in a grander house. There are grander houses. There are dukedoms with larger estates and older titles, and more elaborate ceremony and staffs of 30 where I have managed with 15. I have had offers over the years. I have declined them all, which my colleagues in the profession have considered puzzling, and which I have explained in each case with some version of the same answer, that I have found at Ravenscroft a situation that suits me. That is not the whole of the truth. The whole of the truth is that I stayed because I was present for what happened in the year after His Grace returned from the campaign, and because having been present for it, nothing that came after could seem adequate by comparison. I do not mean this in any grand or sentimental sense. I mean it quite precisely, that having watched two people who had each been diminished by their particular circumstances find, in each other, the specific and sustaining relief of being seen whole, having watched that happen, from the particular vantage point of someone who was never quite in the room and never quite out of it, I had witnessed something I could not improve upon by going elsewhere. So I stayed, and the hall grew around us. The children, the tenants, the particular texture of a great house in its middle years when it has found its rhythm and knows what it is. And I have been here for all of it, attentive and observant and keeping my counsel, as a good valet does. But I began this account intending to set down the full year, and I have been somewhat less than full in certain of its middle passages. Let me repair that. The months between December and March were, in their day-to-day texture, unremarkable in the way that important things often are while they are happening. The compound applications continued, twice a week in December, once a week through January and into February, as the results justified the reduction. The Thursday hours in the library continued and expanded. The quality of His Grace's engagement with the world continued to change, in the way that character changes when it is genuinely loosening. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, specific ways that are visible only to someone who has been paying attention over a long time. I was paying attention. One thing I noticed in December was the change in the quality of his mornings. He had been waking before 5 since July. I know this because I have always been a light sleeper, and his movements above my room in the pre-dawn hours had become, in the summer and autumn, one of the background sounds of the house, as regular and as grim in its regularity as a clock. In December, this began to change. The pre-dawn pacing slowed. He slept later, not late, not by any ordinary standard, but the difference between 4:30 and 6 was significant in what it implied about the quality of the rest preceding it. I did not remark on this. I simply noted it and stored it with the other things I was noting. Another thing I noticed in January was the correspondence. His Grace had always been a thorough correspondent. It was one of the things his position required, and one of the things he did competently and without apparent difficulty. But his correspondence since the return had been what I can only call minimum necessary. The letters that could not go unanswered, answered with the precision and economy of someone who is completing an obligation and no more. In January, I noticed letters going out that did not have this quality. A letter to Halcott that ran to 3 pages, on the subject of a book they had both read, which was not a correspondence of obligation, but of genuine engagement. A letter to the County Historical Society responding to an inquiry about the Ravenscroft estate records, which was thorough and specific, and contained 2 observations that were, by the Society's subsequent response, the kind of contribution they had not expected and were very glad to have. A letter to the widow of one of his officers, which I only know of because I saw the direction on the envelope and recognized the name, and which I did not read, and which he sealed himself. The correspondence was one of those small, specific indicators that tells you more about a person's inner state than the large, visible things do. He was returning to the world, not performing a return, not managing an appearance of return, but actually going back to it, interested in it, engaged with it, in communication with it. And this was happening, I believed, because he was no longer entirely alone in his interior. Someone had been there with him, in those Thursday hours, not requiring him to perform anything, simply being present in the way of someone who was genuinely interested in who was there. And this had changed the quality of the interior from a room in which a man was alone with his grief and his wound to a room that had, gradually, enough warmth in it to sustain other things alongside them. I am aware that this is somewhat lyrical for a valet's account. I offer it without apology. I was there, and this is what I observed, and the most accurate description I can give it is the one I have given. February brought, among other things, The account of the engagement that Miss Voss gave me in the small receiving room, which I have already set down. But it brought also, on the Thursday after that conversation, a shift in the quality of the Thursday hours that was perceptible to me even from the passage. They were quieter that Thursday, not in a constrained way. The silence did not have the texture of silence that is being maintained over something difficult. It had the texture of silence between people who have said something significant to each other and are now simply in each other's presence with the full weight of the thing said between them, and are finding the weight comfortable rather than oppressive. I brought the coal at 11 and opened the door and found them both reading. He at his desk with the natural philosophy text he had been working through, she in the chair across from it with a publication from the Apothecaries' Society that she consulted on Thursdays, and neither of them looked up when I entered, and neither of them was performing the ease of the situation. They were simply in it. I stoked the fire and went out and thought, this is what it is. I will record one more specific scene from this period, because it has stayed with me and because I believe it is telling. It was a Tuesday in March, not a Thursday, not the appointed day. His Grace rang for me at 2:30 in the afternoon, which was unusual, as he generally managed his afternoons without requiring my attendance. I went to the library and found him at his desk with a letter in his hand and an expression that I could not immediately read. He said, "Pitsworth, the village apothecary, what are her hours on Tuesdays?" I said, "Miss Voss opens the shop at 8 and closes at 4, Your Grace. She takes her midday meal between noon and 2:30. He said, "She would be in the shop at this hour." I said, "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at the letter in his hand for a moment. He set it down. He said, "I received some correspondence this morning that is relevant to a matter we have been discussing. A publication from the Royal Society that bears on the compound she has been developing. I thought she might. I will send it to her." I said, "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I have it delivered this afternoon?" He said, "Yes," a pause, "No," another pause, "I will take it myself." He said this with a slight quality of having arrived at the conclusion by process of reasoning rather than impulse, of having considered the alternatives and found this one preferable, though the reasoning behind the preference was not something he intended to make explicit. I said, "Shall I call for the horse, Your Grace?" He said, "I will walk." He took his coat and his hat and the publication, and he went out, and he walked the 1.5 miles to the village on a Tuesday afternoon in March, which was not a Thursday, and he went to the apothecary shop, and he gave her the publication, and they talked for, I learned from Mrs. Harcastle, who had it from Bess, who had it from the girl who helped Miss Voss in the shop, approximately an hour and a half. He came back at 5, and he came in the door with a quality about him that I had not seen since before the campaign. The quality of a man who has done something that was not required and not efficient and not managed, and who is, as a result, rather more himself than he usually is. He said nothing about it. He asked for his dinner and went to change his coat. I pressed the coat he had worn without being asked and set it away. I thought about Tuesday afternoons, and about the things people do when they are not doing what they are supposed to be doing, and about how those things reveal the shape of what they actually want. April arrived, and with it the walks that I have already described, and they were, I want to be more precise about them than I was, not the walks of two people who are observing a formality. They were the walks of two people who were discovering each other in movement, which is a different thing from discovering each other in conversation across a desk, and which reveals different and complementary things. He walked the way he did everything, precisely, purposefully, with his attention active rather than decorative. She walked the way she did everything, with purposeful stride and active observation, noticing things in the landscape that he had walked past many times without specifically noting, and naming them when they were medically or practically relevant. She noticed, on the second walk, that the hedgerow on the east side of the lane leading to the home farm had a section that had been allowed to get too thin, and said so. He listened, and on the following Monday Tolley received instructions about the hedgerow. She noticed, on the fourth walk, that one of the tenant cottages had a chimney that was drawing badly based on the quality of the smoke, which was a thing that neither he nor Tolley had noted, because neither of them had Mrs. Portman's eye for domestic inefficiency embedded in them by 30 years of managing a household. He sent someone to look at the chimney. The chimney was remedied. She was not offering these observations to impress him. She was simply someone who paid attention to the world she moved through, and when she noticed something that could be remedied, she said so, with the same directness she brought to everything. He received the observations with the attentiveness of a man who had been managing an estate for 2 decades and had a genuine commitment to managing it well, and who had just discovered that walking the grounds with someone who looked at them differently was producing information he would not have had otherwise. This was, I thought, a very efficient arrangement for both of them. And it was also, I watched them on these walks from my appropriate distance, and I noted the small things, the inclination of his head when she spoke, the slight change in her stride when she was thinking about something he had said, considerably more than efficient. He attended Halcott's dinner in April, which I have described. I will add only that Halcott came to call the following Thursday morning, which was a visit that would not have occurred in the preceding 9 months, because the preceding 9 months had made such visits unwelcome, and that his reception was warm, and the conversation lasted through the morning and into luncheon, and that I had occasion to pass through the hall during this visit, and to note that the quality of the conversation between them was the quality of 2 men who have been friends for 30 years and who are, on a particular day, simply being friends again without the weight of one of them being in a difficult situation that neither of them quite knows how to acknowledge. Mrs. Halcott sent a note to Ravenscroft Hall the following week, inviting His Grace and Miss Voss to a small informal dinner. I delivered this note to His Grace's desk and said nothing at all about it. He replied the same afternoon. They went to the dinner in May, the week before the Dowager arrived. I have not mentioned this because the important event of May was the Dowager, but the dinner at Halcott's was, in its own way, significant. The first social occasion at which they appeared together in someone else's house, at someone else's table, as guests rather than as employer and employee. The Halcotts received them with the ease of old friends receiving someone they have been hoping to see again, and Miss Voss received the Halcotts with the pleasant directness that was her manner with everyone, and the dinner was, by Halcott's own report to me, the following week, in the stable yard where we happened to meet on a Monday morning, in the casually matter-of-fact way that Halcott communicated most things. The best evening we've had in years, Pitsworth. She's exactly right for him, you know. She looks at him properly. I said, yes, sir, she does. He said he laughed twice, at the table. I haven't heard him laugh since before James died. I said, I know, sir. He said, good, well, he patted his horse. Good. He rode away, and I went back to the house, and I thought about the particular quality of relief that belongs to someone who loves a person and has been unable to help them, discovering that help has come from an unexpected direction. The Dowager's visit I have described adequately. I will add only one exchange that I did not include in my earlier account, because it occurred in a context that I only learned of afterward. On the last morning of her visit, the Dowager came to the library before breakfast and found her son there alone. He was always in the library by 7, and it was not yet 8. And she closed the door and she said to him, directly, the thing that she had been holding since she arrived. He told me this himself. In the dry, slightly rueful way he described things he was willing to acknowledge but not willing to dwell on. He said she told him that she had been afraid, when she first heard the reports of what the wound looked like, that she would find him permanently altered in a way that the wound could not account for. That she had been afraid the thing that made him himself, the particular quality of engagement and commitment and private warmth that had always lived behind the controlled exterior, would not come back. He said she told him that she had been wrong to be afraid. He said she told him that whoever Miss Voss was and wherever she had come from, the correct thing had happened, and that she, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft, was prepared to say so clearly and not in the form of notes to dressmakers. He told me this with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and fond exasperation, and he said, "My mother is, on occasion, impossible to argue with." I said, "Yes, Your Grace, she is." He said, "I don't know whether to be grateful for that or resigned to it." I said, "In my experience, Your Grace, the two are not incompatible." He looked at me with the expression I have described before, and he went back to his correspondence. June, the Assembly. I have described the Assembly adequately. What I want to add is what happened after they left it. I followed at a distance, as was my function. They walked home, not to the hall, not yet, but to the village, to the apothecary shop, which was on the way. It was a fine June evening. the sky still light though the sun was down, the particular long English dusk of early summer that gives the world a quality of held breath. They walked side by side in the lane, not touching. They were still, at this point, maintaining a careful propriety in the presence of potential observers, and talking in the easy, continuous way of people who never quite run out of things to say to each other. I was far enough back that I could not hear what was being said. I could see only the quality of the movement, the slight changes of pace and direction that attend an animated conversation, the inclination of his head toward her when she said something he was responding to, the particular alertness in her posture when she was making a point. They stopped at the door of the shop. They stood for a moment. She said something and he replied, and then he did something I had not seen him do in 23 years with anyone except his mother and his brother and Halcott. He reached out and took her hand, briefly, for perhaps 5 seconds, a hold rather than a grasp, and then released it, and she stood for a moment, and then she said something else and went inside, and he stood at the closed door for a moment with an expression that I could see even from my distance, and that I will not attempt to describe, and then he turned and came back down the lane toward where I was waiting. He walked past me without stopping. I fell in behind him at the correct distance. He said without turning, "Pitsworth." I said, "Your Grace." He said, "The evening went well." I said, "It did, Your Grace." He said nothing else. We walked back to the hall in the June evening, and the house was lit warmly against the darkening sky, and he went up the steps and in through the door, and I followed, and the evening was over. But the hand, the 5 seconds of the hand, that was the moment, I think, not the assembly itself, not the introduction, not any of the things that were visible to the county, but that private moment in the lane when he reached out and took her hand and held it for 5 seconds in the June dusk. That was the moment when something private and real between them became something that lived in the body rather than only in the mind, and that could not be taken back. I am aware that this is a great deal of significance to assign to 5 seconds and a hand. I maintain it nonetheless. July I have described, the walk to the shop, the proposal, the return, the telling of Mrs. Hardcastle. I will add only what I did not include in my first account, which is the description Miss Voss gave me afterward when she came to the hall the following Thursday. She came at 9 as always, and she made her rounds, and at 10 she came to the library, and then at noon she came out and found me in the passage and said, "Mr. Pitsworth, may I trouble you for a moment?" We sat in the small receiving room. She said, "I would like to tell you what he said when he asked me." I said, "If you wish to." She said, "He came into the shop at 10:30. He had walked from the hall, which I had not expected. I was in the middle of something, and I asked him to wait a moment, and he waited, and when I came to the counter, he said, 'I would like to speak with you privately if you can spare the time.'" She paused. I had never heard him say "if you can spare the time" before. He is generally not a man who frames things as requests in that specific way. I said, "No, he is not." She said, "I took him to the back room and shut the door. He stood in the middle of the room. He did not sit, though I offered him a chair, and he said, 'I am aware that I am not an uncomplicated proposition. I'm aware that what I am is not what most women would be looking for, given the option of looking elsewhere. I'm also aware," and he stopped, and then he said, "I want to be honest with you. I have not been entirely at ease in the world for a long time, but I have been at ease with you. And that is something I do not want to lose, and I believe that what I am offering you is something genuine, and I would like—" She stopped. She said, "He got somewhat tangled at that point." I said, "Yes, he would." She said, "He said, 'I am proposing marriage. I want to be clear about that. I would like you to marry me. And I want you to know that the asking is not something I am doing because it is the appropriate form or because the arrangement we have had requires it. I am asking because I cannot imagine spending the rest of my life without your company, and that seems to me a sufficient reason to ask." The small receiving room was very quiet. Through the window the August morning was bright and clear. I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said yes, and then I said that I needed him to understand something first." I said, "What did you need him to understand?" She said, "I told him that I had spent a great deal of my life being overlooked or insufficient or secondary, and that I had made my peace with it, because making peace with things is what you do when they are true and you cannot change them. And that what he had given me over the past year was the specific experience of not being overlooked, of being looked at and found, and that I needed to know, before I said yes to anything permanent, that this was not a kindness or a gratitude or a transitional thing, that it was what he actually wanted. I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said, I have been looked at as a scar for 11 months. I know very precisely what it is to be overlooked, and I know very precisely the difference between someone who sees you and someone who is performing the seeing." He said, "I see you, Alara. That is not a kindness. That is simply what is true." She stopped. She looked out the window. She said quietly, "He used my name." I said, "He does not do that easily." She said, "I know," a pause, "I know." She gathered herself and rose and said, "I will see myself out, Mr. Pitsworth." And she went out, and I sat in the small receiving room and held the account of it carefully, in the interior where I keep the things I observe and do not speak. I thought, here, this is the center of it, not the assembly, not the walks, not any of the visible things. This, in the back room of an apothecary shop, on a Tuesday in July, two people telling each other the truth about what they were and what they needed and what they were prepared to give, this was the center. I have been a valet for 30 years. I have served great houses and considerable people, and I have observed a great many things. And what I have observed more than anything else is that the visible things, the ceremonies and the public gestures and the acknowledged moments, are not usually where the significant things happen. The significant things happen in the rooms with closed doors and the passages before and after, and the 5 seconds of a hand held in a lane in June dusk. They happen in the small receiving room, where a woman tells you what someone said when he used her name. I have been privileged to observe this. I have been privileged to observe all of it. August. The wedding preparations occupied August, which is to say that Mrs. Harcastle occupied August with the focused intensity of a woman who has a clear vision of what a thing should be, and the 30 years of experience required to bring that vision into being. She managed the hall's contribution with the same invisible efficiency that she brought to everything, and she managed the dowager's contribution, which arrived in several letters from Bath with specific and occasionally incompatible opinions about specific and occasionally minor details, with the diplomatic skill of someone who has dealt with the dowager for a decade and a half, and has developed a finely calibrated sense of which battles are worth having and which are not. His Grace was not, during this period, particularly occupied with the wedding preparations. He had the good sense, which is one of the things about him I have always respected, to understand that his most useful role in the proceedings was a selective and specific one, and that the overall management was better left to the people who managed such things, and he confined himself to 3 contributions. The first being the matter of the settlement, which he handled directly and privately with Miss Voss, and which she received with the cool-headed practical attention of someone who understands money and does not perform ignorance about it as a form of modesty. The second being the ring, which he chose himself from the family vault with considerable care, and which he showed to me before he showed it to anyone else, in the way that he sometimes showed me things he had decided on before announcing them, as a form of confirmation, and the third being a conversation with Mrs. Portman when she arrived, that lasted 45 minutes, and that Mrs. Portman subsequently described to Bess as very satisfactory indeed. He said exactly the right things. I have spent some time wondering what the right things were. I did not ask, and Mrs. Portman did not volunteer, and this is one of the small few gaps in my knowledge of the year that I have to accept. I believe the general shape of it was this. He told her that he understood what he was asking of Miss Voss, that he understood the particular history of the previous engagement and the specific significance of what he was undertaking, and that he intended to be worthy of it. I believe he may have said it with the particular care and precision that he brought to things he meant very seriously, and I believe Mrs. Portman, who was a direct and perceptive woman, received it as it was meant. At any rate, she was entirely on his side from that conversation forward, which was the right outcome. The wedding itself I have described. I want to return to one specific moment of it that I mentioned in passing and did not give its due. The vicar, who had known the Ravenscroft family for 30 years, and who had, along with the rest of the county, been watching the developments of the past year with the particular invested interest of a clergyman in a rural parish who understands that his flock is also his community, performed the ceremony with the warm precision of someone who is doing something he believes in. He had been, I learned afterward, specifically requested by His Grace to keep the ceremony simple, which request the vicar had received with the understanding that simple in this context meant without unnecessary ceremony rather than without meaning, and he had calibrated accordingly. When they exchanged their vows, when Miss Voss spoke her vows, in the steady, clear voice that she brought to everything that mattered, the church was so quiet that I could hear the slight sound of Mrs. Portman's handkerchief. And when he spoke his vows, when Edmund Ashworth, 9th Duke of Ravenscroft, who was a man of enormous reserve and enormous care with words, said the words that the ceremony required him to say, he said them to her, and to no one else in the room, looking at her with the direct and settled attention of a man who is saying something entirely true, which is the rarest quality in any declaration and the most unmistakable. She looked back at him with the gray eyes, and she was still, and she received it. That was the ceremony. The ring went on her finger, and the vicar said the words, and it was done, and the church exhaled, and the organ began, and the county and the village rose, and I stood at the back and thought that the story had found its correct ending, and that I had been present for every difficult and tender and impossible moment of it, and that I was grateful for that beyond my capacity to express. We walked out into the September sun. I want to say one more thing before I close this account. It is about the scar. The scar is what it is. It did not disappear. Miss Voss's compound reduced the tightening substantially over the year of treatment, and he recovered the full range of movement in his head and neck that the wound had temporarily restricted, and this was a real and specific improvement in his daily comfort. But the scar itself, the pale pink ridge of it, the way it pulled at the outer corner of his eye, the way it caught the light in certain conditions, remained and will remain. He has lived with it for 12 years now, and in those 12 years I have observed his relationship with it change in a way that I think is worth noting. In the first year, the year of the story, it was the thing he could not face in a mirror. In the years that followed, it became simply a part of his face, the way a feature becomes a feature, present, noted, not remarked upon. The county adapted. The children, all 4 of them, grew up with it as one of the specific and particular things about their father's face, no more remarkable to them than his dark hair or his eyes. The youngest daughter's question, which I have recorded, was the question of a 5-year-old encountering something she wanted to understand, not the question of a child who has been taught that something is remarkable. And she, his wife, her Grace, whom the county and the staff and the family and I have all over 12 years come to think of simply as her, the specific and irreplaceable person she is. She has, in those 12 years, given no indication that the scar is a thing requiring management or acknowledgement or navigation. She looks at her husband as she always has, at him, at the person behind and within and around every feature of his face, the scar included. She kisses it. The youngest daughter observed this correctly and with the unerring perceptiveness of a 5-year-old. She kisses it, not as a statement or a performance or a gesture of healing, as what it is, which is the expression of love toward a specific person who happens to have that face, who happened to come home from a war with that wound, who happened, through the intervention of Mrs. Harcastle's reasonable suggestion and a November Thursday and the accumulated Thursdays after that, to find the person who looked at him as a person rather than as a thing that had happened to a person. Because she loves him. That is the same thing. As the youngest daughter said, and as she was entirely right, that is exactly the same thing. I am 61 years old, and my hand is still steady, and the hall is warm around me as I write, and I have set down the story as faithfully as I can. I fold these pages now and put them away in the place I keep such things, which is a box in the back of my wardrobe that has not been opened by anyone but me in 23 years, and which will, I trust, remain similarly private for the foreseeable future. The afternoon is advancing. There are things to attend to. There is always, in a great house, something that requires attention. I put on my coat. I go out into the hall. Above me in the rooms of the house, the family goes about its day, the children's voices from somewhere above, the footsteps of his wife across the landing, the particular quality of sound that belongs to a house that is fully inhabited by people who are glad to be in it. At the top of the stairs, a door opens. His youngest daughter appears, sees me below, and says, with the directness that she has not grown out of and that I trust she never will, "Pitsworth, Papa is looking for you." I say, "Thank you, miss, I'll go to him directly." She nods with the satisfied certainty of a small person who has accomplished a task, and goes back the way she came. I go up the stairs. The house is warm around me. The afternoon light comes in at the west windows and makes the hall golden. Somewhere above, the Duke of Ravenscroft is looking for his valet, in the ordinary way of a man who has an ordinary need in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. I go to him. This is all there is to it. This is, in the end, exactly enough. I want to return to October and to the shop, because I have not given the shop its due. The shop was, I came to understand over the months that followed my first visit, not merely a place of business. It was also a kind of argument, a visible, daily, ongoing argument against the particular way the world had arranged itself around Miss Voss's possibilities. She had been educated beyond what most women of her background were educated, not because anyone had decided that this was appropriate, but because her father had done it, and because she had proven capable of it, and because the work required it, and because all three of these things together had produced a situation that was simply the situation, which she inhabited without making any special case for it, and without pretending it did not make her unusual. The shop was the expression of this, well-ordered, well-stocked, managed with the precision of someone who understands both the pharmacological and the commercial dimensions of what she is doing, maintained at standards that no one had required her to maintain, but that she had determined were correct. She worked long hours. She kept records that were significantly more detailed than the circumstances required, because she believed. I learned this from conversations that Mrs. Hardcastle had with her and reported to me, because I was not present at the conversations, but Mrs. Hardcastle was always generous with intelligence that she judged useful, that careful records were the only reliable basis for any claim she could make about the efficacy of what she was doing, and that without them she was working on intuition rather than evidence, and that intuition was not a foundation she trusted. She had been, I understood, the best student her father had ever had. He had told her this, apparently, with the directness of a man who respected her too much to soften it. Not the best student he had ever had considering she was a girl, but the best student, full stop, with the further observation that this placed certain responsibilities on her that she would have to discharge without assistance, since the world was not arranged to assist her in them. She had received this observation with the pragmatism of someone who has known the world long enough to find his description of it accurate. She had not been, I gathered, bitter about any of this. Pragmatism is different from bitterness, and she was very firmly in the category of pragmatism. She had found the situation as it was, and had made of it what she could make, which was, by the evidence, considerably more than most people would have made of it. And she had maintained, through everything, the quality of genuine interest in her work that distinguished the excellent from the merely competent. She was fascinated by what she did, genuinely, not as a performance of enthusiasm, but as a feature of her actual character. And this fascination was one of the things about her that was immediately visible to anyone who spent 5 minutes in conversation with her on any subject that touched on medicine. His Grace recognized this quality in her immediately, which did not surprise me, because he had the same quality himself in relation to the things that interested him, and because people who have a genuine intellectual passion tend to recognize it when they encounter it in someone else, the way a musician recognizes real musicianship in a stranger without needing to be told. This was, I think, one of the foundations of what grew between them, not just the need on his part for someone who could see past the wound to the person, and not just the need on her part for someone who could see past the abandoned girl to the person, but also a genuine mutual recognition of people who were actually interested in things and who were accustomed, in their respective contexts, to this quality of interest being somewhat unusual. He was interested in natural philosophy, in the management of estates and the systems and economies within which estates existed, in history in a particular way, not the parade of events but the underlying structures, the way systems changed and why they changed and what they preserved even when everything else was different. She was interested in medicine in the way I have described, in the specific puzzle of how the human body worked and how it failed and how it could be helped to not fail, in the accumulating evidence of careful observation, in the developing knowledge that she was perpetually reading toward and never quite reaching, which she found energizing rather than frustrating. They had between them an enormous amount to talk about. This was, in addition to everything else, practically useful. It meant that the Thursday hours could have ranged over any topic and found something genuine to work with, and it meant that the silence between them, when there was silence, was never the silence of two people who have run out of things to say, but always the silence of two people who are thinking about something rather than thinking about what to say next. I am aware that I keep returning to the quality of the conversations, and I want to explain why. It is because the conversations were, in a real sense, the substance of the year. They were where the thing that grew between them grew. Not in any single moment, not in the application of the compound, not in the walk in the North Field, not even in the 5 seconds of the hand in June, but in the accumulated hours of genuine exchange, in the specific texture of two people talking to each other with the particular ease of people who have stopped performing and are simply being. This ease is hard to achieve and easy to destroy. It requires a sustained absence of the need to manage the impression one is making, which is a very difficult thing for most people to sustain because most people are, to a greater or lesser degree, managing the impression they make at all times. His Grace had always been a private man, which meant that the managing was considerable, and it had been more considerable since the return from the campaign, when the thing being managed had a specific and visible focus. Miss Voss had her own version of the management, the careful self-presentation of a woman who knew she was operating outside the expected parameters and who had learned, through experience, that the management of how she was perceived was directly relevant to her ability to continue working. In each other's company, by degrees, they stopped managing. I noticed this first in him because I had more data about him. The slight relaxation of the careful control in his voice when he spoke to her about something that genuinely interested him. The increasing frequency with which he said things that he would not have said to most people. The quality of ease in his posture that was different from the controlled ease of social competence. I noticed it in her by comparison and contrast. The difference between how she was with patients in the household, which was professionally warm and entirely competent and managed in the specific way of a practitioner, and how she was in the library across the desk from him, which had gradually over the months become something that I can only describe as herself, unmanaged, present. Two people who are both unmanaged in each other's company, this is rare. I have observed it perhaps 3 times in 30 years. It is, when it occurs, unmistakable. I want now to describe the period of preparation for the September wedding in more detail than I have given it, because it was, in its own way, revealing. His Grace's primary contribution to the wedding preparations, I said, was the settlement, the ring, and the conversation with Mrs. Portman. This is true as far as it goes. What I omitted, because I am not sure it falls within the category of contribution, is the quality of his attention in the weeks preceding the wedding. He was, in those weeks, more attentive to the household than he had been since before the campaign. He walked the grounds in the mornings and noted things he wanted attended to before the wedding. The drive had a section that needed raking. The terrace overlooking the garden had a loose stone. And he communicated these things to Tolley and to the gardener, and to myself with the specific, practical attention of a man who is thinking about a thing as it ought to be rather than as it happens to be, and who is making the adjustments accordingly. He wrote to the Halcotts. He wrote to the officers and friends who had been invited with personal notes in addition to the formal invitations. He wrote to the regimental chaplain who had known James to invite him to the wedding. He wrote to James's grave. I know this because I found the letter on his desk one morning half-written, and I moved it to the edge of the desk without reading it and went about my work, and when I came back in the afternoon, it was gone. I do not know whether he finished it or burned it or sealed it and put it away somewhere. I know that the writing of it was real, and that the impulse to write it, to include his brother in the day, in whatever form was possible, was entirely characteristic of the man I had served for 23 years, and that it told me something about the state of his heart that I was glad to know. The day of the wedding he was, by his standards, calm. He ate breakfast, which was not always guaranteed in circumstances that might produce anxiety in another person. He dressed with his usual precision, and without any of the signs of difficulty that I had sometimes observed in the preceding months, when the dressing involved facing what was visible in the mirrors. He stood in front of the mirror. I watched this. It was, in the 18 months of my careful observation, only the second time he had stood fully in front of the large glass since the mirrors were returned in November. And he stood in it, and looked at himself with the still, assessing attention of a man who has made his peace with what he sees, not because it is what he would have preferred to see, but because it is what is true, and because the truth of it has been received and held by someone who saw it whole, and did not flinch from it. He straightened his cravat. He turned slightly to the left and looked at the scar in the morning light, with the particular quality of assessment that was his characteristic look at difficult things. Clear-eyed, direct, not flinching. He said, "Pitsworth, do you think it will be remarked upon today?" I said, "Some people will notice it, Your Grace. They generally do not remark on it in the literal sense." He said, "No, they don't." A pause. "I have been thinking about that." I said, "Yes, Your Grace." He said, "I have spent a year assuming that people were thinking about it constantly. That the first thing in every encounter was the scar and everything else was secondary. And I have come to believe," he paused. "I have come to believe that this was not accurate." I said, "Your Grace." He said, "People noticed it, in the way one notices a thing that is new and visible, and then they went on because there are other things in the world. I was the one who kept returning to it as the primary fact." He looked at himself in the glass for another moment. "She didn't." I said, "No, Your Grace, she did not." He said, "The first morning in the library, she looked at me and I was aware of the precise moment when she decided she was done looking at it, which was immediately, and then she looked at me." He was quiet. It was the most unexpected thing I experienced in that entire year, including the wound itself. I said, "I can understand that, Your Grace." He said, "She will be in the church in 2 hours." I said, "Yes, Your Grace." He said, "Good." He adjusted his cravat one final time, looked at himself in the mirror with the settled, ready expression of a man who has made his preparations and is prepared for what comes next, and turned from the glass. "Let us go." We went. The church was full when we arrived. The county, the village, the regimental chaplain from the campaign sitting in a pew near the front with the straightness of military bearing that is not assumed and not abandoned. The dowager in the front pew with her particular friends, dressed beautifully, her posture precisely what her posture always was. The posture of a woman who has not once in her life communicated any of her actual feelings through the angle of her spine. Halcott behind her with Mrs. Halcott, who pressed his Grace's hand when he passed and said, in the small, warm voice she used for things she meant, "She is everything." He said, "Yes." He went to the altar. She came in through the doors at the back of the church. She came with Mrs. Portman beside her, and the organ played, and the church rose, and she walked down the aisle in the dress that was exactly right, and she looked. I want to try to give an accurate description, because I have been a little vague about it, and she deserves better. She looked like herself. That is the most accurate thing I can say. She looked like the woman who had walked into the small receiving room in November with her bag on the floor beside her and her hands in her lap, who had come to the library with the compound in a sealed glass bottle and explained it without overclaiming, who had walked the North Field in April and noticed the angle of the drainage. She looked like the woman who had, every Thursday for a year, sat across the desk from a man in considerable difficulty and given him, week by week, the specific gift of her complete and unmanaged attention. She looked in that dress, in the church, in the September light, like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. He watched her come, and he did not move, and he did not look away. And when she reached him and stood beside him and looked up at him, what passed between them in that moment was the look of two people who have said everything important to each other in private, and are now, in public, simply being the thing they have become. The vicar began. I have written about this already. I will not repeat it. I will only say that I have attended many weddings in many great houses in 30 years, and that I have never before stood at the back of a church and felt, with complete certainty, that the ceremony was the truest possible public expression of something that was already, privately, entirely real. Afterward in the churchyard, afterward in the reception, afterward in the evening, when the guests had gone and the hall was quiet again, and I came to the library to make sure the fire was banked for the night, and found the room empty and the fire low, and on the desk, the natural philosophy text he had been reading the previous week, with his bookmark in it at the same place it had been for 3 days, because he had not, in those 3 days, been reading anything except Miss Voss's notes on the compound, which she had left with him to review. I banked the fire. I turned off the lamp. I stood for a moment in the dark of the library with the smell of the fire and the books and the slight herbal scent that was, by now, part of the smell of the room, and I thought about the year just ended and the years ahead, and I was content. I am 61 years old, and I have been in service for 40 years. And I have served great houses and small houses and houses that fell in between, and I have observed a great many things. The most important thing I have observed, across all of it, is this, that the quality of a house is the quality of the people in it, and the quality of the people in it is the quality of the way they see each other, and the quality of the way they see each other is determined by whether they are willing to look at the actual person rather than at the thing they have decided the person must be. Ravenscroft Hall, in the year that began with His Grace stepping down from a carriage with a scar and a silence, became a house where the actual looking happened. I watched it happen. I was there for every difficult and tender and impossible moment of it. I will be here for the next 20 years if my health holds, observing and keeping my counsel and attending to the things that require attendance. The children will grow. The estate will continue. The Thursdays will continue, though they have not been the formal weekly provision of the first year for a decade now, having long since become simply the way the house runs. She is part of it now, in every sense, and her presence in it is as natural and as fundamental as the fireplaces and the library and the particular quality of light that comes in at the west windows on October afternoons. The scar is there, it will always be there. It has been there for 12 years, and it will be there until he is an old man, and the old man will have it on his face the same as the young man who stepped down from the carriage in July. She will go on kissing it, because she loves it, because she loves him. These are the same thing. I have said this 3 times now in various forms. It is the truest thing in the account, and I do not apologize for saying it repeatedly. The true things deserve saying as many times as needed until they are fully heard. I fold these pages. I put them away. I go out into the hall, which is warm and occupied and fully alive with the sounds of people who are glad to be where they are. The afternoon is waiting. There is always, in a good house, more than enough to do. There are things I have not yet said about the Thursday hours that I want to say, because they are true, and because the account is incomplete without them. I want to describe, with some specificity, the period of late January through February, which was the period that I consider the most significant of the year in terms of what actually happened between them, even though nothing of consequence occurred on the surface of it. The compound applications were in their 2nd month. The Thursday hours in the library were well established. The 2nd cup was always on the tray. What was happening in that period, beneath the surface of all these regular and now unremarkable things, was a change in the quality of the conversation itself. In November and December, the conversations had been not formal, not constrained, but careful. Careful in the specific way that conversations are careful when both parties are intelligent and attentive, and are aware that what is being established between them matters, and do not want to push it in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. They ranged widely, those early conversations, but they ranged over things that were interesting rather than things that were personal, and the personal things that emerged did so incidentally, in the way I have described, as passengers alongside the primary subject rather than as the subject themselves. In January, this changed. I cannot point to a specific Thursday when it changed, because it did not change on one Thursday. It changed in the accumulation of Thursdays, in the same way that the compound was changing the tissue. Gradually, specifically, measurably only when you compared the state of things at a significant interval rather than from week to week. The change was this: they began to say what they actually thought. I mean this precisely. In the early months, he gave her his considered opinion on subjects, which is a different thing from saying what he actually thought. His considered opinion was the opinion he had arrived at through reasoning and evidence and careful qualification, which was always interesting and often right, but which had about it the quality of something worked out in advance rather than something arising now, in this conversation between these two people. She was the same. Her early manner in the Thursday conversations was the manner of a competent professional giving well-considered answers, which was exactly what she was but was not. I came to understand the full extent of what she was. By late January, the considered opinions had given way, not replaced, but supplemented by the actual thoughts. He said things in those Thursday conversations that he had not, by his own subsequent admission to me in various oblique ways, said to anyone else in his life. The specific content of his grief about James, the specific texture of his fear in the early months after the return, about whether he was going to be able to manage himself adequately, The specific way the wound had changed his experience of the world not just physically, but in some more fundamental sense that he described on a Thursday in late February, as the experience of having been marked and the particular loneliness of that, and the particular relief of finding someone for whom the marking was simply a fact and not a defining condition. She said things too, the account of the engagement I have already given. There were other things. The specific experience, over 15 years of working alongside her father, of being the one who was good at what they did in a context where that goodness was permitted only because her father's permission made it possible, and the question of what it had meant for her, practically and otherwise, when his permission was no longer there to be given. The specific experience of finding, in the weeks after his death, that the patients who had been coming to her for 3 years did not need the permission retroactively, that they simply continued to come because she was the one who helped them, and the question of the legitimacy of it turned out to be less urgent than the practical fact of the competence, and the specific quality of that discovery, which was that competence is its own argument when it is allowed to make itself, and that the permission had been necessary and also, in some fundamental sense, beside the point. He listened to this with the attention he gave everything that interested him, and he said, "You have built something very good." She said, "I have built something functional. Whether it is good depends on whether the people who need it are well served by it." He said, "Those are not separable things." She said, "I know, but I am careful about the language of good. It implies a more settled assessment than I usually make." He said, "You are very careful about settled assessments generally." She said, "Experience has encouraged caution." He said, "Yes," a pause, "so has mine." They sat for a moment. He said, I find it less necessary with you, the caution." She said, "So do I." Another pause, the specific quality of which I have already tried to describe and which I will not try to describe again, because once is sufficient, and the thing itself resists repetition. He said, "That is a considerable thing to find." She said, "Yes, it is." This exchange took place on a Thursday in early February, and I set it down as accurately as I can from what I observed through the door, which was not quite closed, and from what the quality of the room when I entered it afterward told me, which was the quality of a room in which something specific and real has been said, and has settled, and has not needed to be said again. I want to describe also one Thursday in March that I have not mentioned, because it was, I think, characteristic of where they had arrived in their understanding of each other by that point. She arrived that Thursday with a problem. She explained when she came to the library after her rounds, attempting to formulate an improved version of a compound she used regularly for respiratory complaints. The village had a high rate of respiratory illness in winter, which she attributed partially to the drainage situation that she and His Grace had discussed on the April walks, and partially to the quality of the air in certain parts of the village where the housing was close and poorly ventilated. She had a hypothesis about an ingredient that would make the compound more effective in the specific cases she was finding most difficult to manage, but the hypothesis depended on a mechanism that she could not fully account for with what she knew, and she had been reading toward the explanation for several weeks without finding it. He listened to this. He said, "What is the mechanism you are trying to account for?" She described it. He said, "That sounds like what Boyle described in," and he named a paper from the Royal Society proceedings that she had not read. He said, "I have it here, or the reprint. I ordered it in December for a different purpose, but the specific section you would want is in the third part." He found the reprint in his desk drawer. He passed it to her. She read the section he indicated with the focused, rapid attention of someone who reads technical material efficiently. And when she looked up, her expression was the expression of a person who has just found the piece that makes the puzzle cohere. She said, "That is exactly the mechanism. That accounts for it." He said, "I thought it might." She said, "When did you read this?" He said, "In January." She said, "You kept it." He said, "I thought it might be useful, at some point." He was looking at his desk. He said, "I did not particularly expect to have an occasion to produce it in this specific context." She looked at him, he looked at the desk. The fire was burning, and the March light was the particular March light I have described, and there was between them one of the silences that had a quality of its own. This one the quality of the recognition of a thing that has been done. He had kept the paper in January because he had thought it might be useful to her, which is a small thing and an entirely characteristic form of attention in the person who gives it, and which she was receiving now with the full awareness of what it meant. She said, "Thank you, Edmund." He said, "You are welcome." She returned to the paper. He returned to his correspondence. They sat in the library together for the rest of the morning in a silence that was very full, and when she went at noon, she left the paper on the desk, and he left it there for a month before putting it away with the other things he kept. I want now to describe the summer, which I have been somewhat brief about. After the proposal in July, the weeks before the September wedding had a quality that was different from any preceding period of the year. A specific, settled ease, the ease of people who have said what needs to be said and now know where they stand and are no longer required to be careful about it. They came and went with a freedom that the winter and spring had not yet permitted. She came to the hall when it suited her, and not only on Thursdays, and he walked to the village on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and whatever other days the estate did not require his immediate presence, and they were seen together in the village and on the grounds and at Halcott's and at the church on Sundays, and the county. With the particular pragmatism of rural English communities that have decided a thing is going to happen and have adjusted accordingly, received this with something that gradually, over the 6 weeks between the proposal and the wedding, settled into warm approval. There was one occasion in August that I want to record, because it is small and characteristic, and I am fond of it. He had been at his desk since early morning with the estate correspondence, which accumulated in August in the way that agricultural things tend to accumulate at harvest time, and at 4 in the afternoon she arrived without particular announcement. She had, by August, adopted a practice of arriving when she felt like arriving, which was a change from the precise Thursday schedule of the preceding months that I noted as significant. And she came through to the library and set her bag down and looked at the desk and said, "You've been in here all day." He said, "I have been in here all morning and most of the afternoon. There is a distinction." She said, "The distinction is approximately 2 hours. It is not significant." She looked at the correspondence. "Is any of this urgent?" He said, "The quarterly accounts from the home farm." She said, "Are they going anywhere tomorrow?" He said, "No." She said, "Then come outside. The light is very fine and it will be dark by 7. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that, in the year of my observation, I had come to understand as the expression he used when he was deciding between 2 things and both things had genuine weight, and he was being asked to choose. He looked at the correspondence, and he looked at her, and then he put his pen down and pushed his chair back and stood up. He said, "I'll need my coat." She said, "I'll wait." He got his coat, they went out. They walked the grounds for 2 hours in the August afternoon, and he came back before dinner with the quality of a man who has been somewhere that was not his desk. And this was, I think, as straightforward and as particular a piece of evidence as anything else I have recorded. That she could simply come and say, "Come outside," and he would put down the pen and go, and that this was unremarkable to both of them. The ordinary way of things between people who have taken their place alongside each other in the daily texture of a life. I find this August afternoon more moving in some ways than anything I have described. The large moments, the proposal, the wedding, the assembly in June, have their own significance and I have given it its due. But the quiet, ordinary moments are where the actual life is, and what I observed in that August afternoon was 2 people for whom the actual life had become, in the most fundamental sense, shared. This is what the year had built. Not the public forms of it, not the introduction at the assembly, not the walk out through the church door. Those were the expression of the thing, the way a scar is the expression of a wound. The thing itself was built in the Thursday hours, in the library, in the conversations that ranged over everything and landed always on the honest and the specific and the real. I keep returning to the quality of honesty between them. I keep returning to it because I have observed, in 30 years of service in great houses, that honesty in personal relations, genuine honesty, the kind that does not perform itself and does not require an audience and does not use the truth as a form of strategy, is the rarest commodity I have encountered. I have seen people be truthful in public and dishonest in private, and truthful to an audience and dishonest to themselves, and truthful in small things and dishonest in large ones. What I saw in His Grace and Miss Voss, in Edmund and Alara, as I think of them in the interior where no one but me is admitted, was something I had not seen before and have not seen since. A consistent, mutual, unperformed honesty that was simply the way they were with each other. From the November morning, when she said what would looking at it have accomplished, to the February afternoon, when she told him what she had needed him to understand before she could say yes. This is the rare thing, not the love which is perhaps common enough in its various forms, the honesty. I am an old man and a valet, and I have spent 40 years in service, and I have kept counsel about everything I have observed. And this is the one thing about which I have decided to set down a record, because it is the one thing I have witnessed that I believe to be genuinely exceptional. The year after the Duke of Ravenscroft came home from the campaign, the Thursday hours in the library, the compound and the specific careful hands and the full attention given to a wound and then to the person around the wound, and the same given in return. The particular quality of what grew from that, the specific and irreplaceable thing that grows when two people who have each been taught to take up less room than they deserve find, in each other, someone who will not permit the smallness. He looked at her and saw her, she looked at him and saw him. This was the whole of it, it was more than enough. Let me say something, in closing, about the nature of service. I have been a servant for 40 years, and I have never found the word degrading or the role less than what it is. A servant, properly understood, is someone who has agreed to make the life of another person function more cleanly and completely than it would function without them, and who performs this agreement with the full exercise of their particular capacities, and the particular understanding that the value of what they do is not diminished by the fact that they do it in service of someone else rather than for themselves. I have always thought of this as a dignified arrangement rather than a humbling one, and I have encountered enough people in my career who did not understand that distinction to know that it is not always obvious. What I want to say about service is this. The particular form of service I performed in the year after His Grace's return was not primarily the service of pressing his coat and polishing his boots and attending to the fire in the library. It was the service of being present, of being in every room and every passage, the consistent, attentive, unintrusive witness to what was happening. The person who noticed the second cup on the tray and the reprint in the desk drawer and the 5 seconds of the hand in the lane, and who held all of these things carefully in the interior where such things are held, and who said nothing at all about any of them except in this account, which is written for no one but myself. That is a form of service. It is perhaps the most important form of service I have performed in 40 years of performing it. I say this not out of any desire for recognition, which is not something a valet cultivates as a professional aspiration. I say it because I want to be accurate about what the year was and what role I played in it, and the role I played in it was primarily this. I watched. I noticed. I held what I noticed with care, and once in October I made a proposal to His Grace about the household's medical provisions that was, in its own quiet way, the most consequential proposal I have ever made. Mrs. Harcastle made it, technically. I will give her the full credit, which she deserves and which she has never, in the decade since, either requested or declined, because she is precisely the kind of person who does not require credit for the things she does correctly, having sufficient internal satisfaction in having done them. Between us, in October in the pantry over tea, we changed the direction of a life. Perhaps 2 lives or several lives, depending on how you count. It was not much of an intervention, on the surface of it. It was a cup of tea and a mild suggestion and the name of a woman in the village. But the surface is rarely where the significant things are, and I have spent 40 years learning to look below the surface of things. And what I saw below the surface of that October conversation was the particular shape of a need and the particular shape of a person who might meet it, and I thought, these fit. I was right. I have been right about most of the important things. I will be, I trust, right about a few more before I am done. The afternoon advances, the hall is warm. The children are somewhere above, going about the complicated and essential business of being children in a house where they are, entirely and without qualification, wanted. His Grace is in the library, which is where he generally is at this hour of the afternoon. His wife is in the small sitting room that adjoins the library, which she has made her own in the 12 years since the September wedding, with the natural philosophy texts and the apothecary's publications, and the particular order of a mind that has always known precisely where everything is and why it is there. Their doors are adjacent. They open into the same passage. There is, between those two rooms in the middle of the afternoon, a quality of warmth that is not the warmth of the fires, though the fires are good. It is the warmth of two people in adjacent rooms who know that the other is there, who have known it for 12 years, who will know it for however many years the world permits. I go up the stairs to see about the evening. The youngest daughter is on the landing. She looks at me with her mother's gray eyes and her father's precise attention, and she says, "He's in the library, Pittsworth." I say, "Thank you, miss." She says, "He said to send you in directly." I say, "I'll go directly." She nods, satisfied, and goes back to whatever she was doing before she was doing this, which is the privilege of someone who has been given, from the beginning, the full freedom to simply be herself in the house where she lives. I go to the library, I knock, I go in. The Duke of Ravenscroft is at his desk. The scar is on his face, as it has been for 12 years and will be for however many more years the world permits. He looks up when I come in, and he looks at me with the expression he has had for the past decade, the one that is more alive, slightly self-aware, that does not refuse what is pleasant about things, and he says, "Pittsworth, there is a letter here from the Royal Society that I want to discuss with my wife. Would you ask her if she is free for half an hour?" I say, "Of course, Your Grace." I go to the adjacent door, I knock. I hear her voice saying, "Come in," and I go in, and she is at her table with her publications arranged around her with the exact order of a person who knows precisely where everything is. And she looks up when I enter with the gray eyes and the direct, level attention that was the first thing I noticed about her when she walked into the receiving room on a November Thursday, and sat down with her hands in her lap and her bag on the floor beside her, and looked at the window without fidgeting. I say, "His Grace asks if you are free for half an hour. There is a letter from the Royal Society he wishes to discuss." She says, "Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes." I say, "Yes, Your Grace." I go back to the passage between the two doors, and I stand there for a moment, and the hall is warm around me, and the afternoon light is coming through the west windows at the angle that makes the dust motes visible, and somewhere above the children are going about their lives, and in the library a Duke of Ravenscroft is waiting with a letter from the Royal Society, and in the adjacent room his wife is setting aside her publications to go to him. And in 5 minutes the adjacent door will open, and she will cross the passage and go into the library, and they will read the letter together and talk about it in the way they talk about things, with the particular, genuine, mutual attention of two people who are actually interested in what the other has to say. This is Tuesday. It is not Thursday. It has not been only Thursdays for a very long time. I go to see about the fire in the drawing room. The afternoon is fine. Everything is as it should be. There is a morning in December, the December of the first year, 6 weeks after his return, that I have not yet described and that I want to describe now, because it was one of the moments when I understood that what was happening was real, and not merely the effect of one person's careful attentions on a man who had become susceptible, in his condition, to any form of consideration. He came to breakfast at 7, which was earlier than I had seen him appear since the return. He ate, which he had been doing more consistently since November, though with the provisional quality of a man who is performing the maintenance functions of life rather than particularly interested in them. He took his coffee, and he stood at the window of the breakfast room that looks out over the south lawn, which was covered in frost, and he stood there for perhaps 5 minutes in a stillness that was different from the stillness he had been carrying since the return. I noticed the difference. The stillness since the return had been the stillness of a man maintaining control over something that was not quite under control, the stillness of effort. The stillness at the window that December morning was the stillness of a man who is simply looking at something and finding it adequate to look at. The frost on the lawn, the pale December light, the particular quality of a winter morning in the English countryside that is not pretty in any obvious way, but that has its own specific spare completeness. He said without turning, "Pittsworth." I said, "Your Grace." He said, "The lawn is hard this morning. Good skating weather if anyone still skated." I said, "The Halcott children skate, I believe, on the pond." He said, "James used to skate on the pond." A pause. "He fell in twice. Once on purpose and once by accident, and the once by accident was more dignified than the once on purpose, which should be a lesson about something." He said this with a dryness that was not bitterness and not performed cheerfulness, but something closer to the genuine thing. The quality of a memory that can be held and even found slightly amusing, rather than the quality of a memory that is only ever painful. I said, "Yes, Your Grace." He turned from the window. He set down his coffee cup. He said, "I slept last night." I said, "I am glad to hear it, Your Grace." He said, properly, not the managed half-sleep that is the best one can do. Actually slept. He looked at me with the expression that was, on that morning, slightly different from the expressions I had been cataloging for 5 months, more directly present, more. I want to say more himself, though he had always been, by any external measure, thoroughly himself. He said, "I do not know quite what to make of that." I said, "Perhaps, Your Grace, it does not require making. Perhaps it can simply be true." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Yes, perhaps it can." He went to the library. He was there until noon, not with the correspondence but with the natural philosophy text, which was the first time since the return that he had been in the library with that particular book rather than the correspondence or nothing at all. The text was one he had been working through before the campaign, a sustained engagement with current thinking in the field that required sustained concentration, and that had not been available to him since the return, because sustained concentration requires a certain quality of interior stillness, and the interior had not, until recently, been still enough. I noted the text, I noted the stillness, I did not remark on either. But I held them in the interior where I hold such things, and I thought, Thursday mornings. Whatever is happening on Thursday mornings in the library, that is what has made the difference. It was December. She had been coming for 6 weeks. In 6 weeks she had done what nothing, and no one else in 5 months had been able to do. Not a cure, not a resolution, not an end to the wound or the grief, but a specific shift in the quality of the interior from a place where nothing could grow because everything was given over to the management of the wound, to a place where something could exist alongside the wound, and the wound could exist alongside it. This is what I want to say about her in the end, in addition to everything else I have said, that she did not fix anything. I want to be very precise about this, because the version of the story in which she fixed him is a smaller story and a less true one, and she would object to it on professional grounds. She applied a compound to a scar with skilled hands and genuine care. She sat across a desk on Thursday mornings and gave her full, honest, unmanaged attention to a man who had almost forgotten what that felt like. She talked about things that interested her with the specific quality of a person, for whom the thinking is real rather than performed, and she received what he said with the specific quality of a person who is actually listening rather than waiting for her turn. She did not fix him, she was present, she was honest, she was genuinely interested in who was actually there. This was what was needed, not the cure but the presence, not the resolution but the company of someone who was willing to sit in the unresolved room and find it worth sitting in. He did the rest himself. The sleeping was something he did. The return to the natural philosophy text was something he did. The letter to the widow of his officer, and the response to the Royal Society inquiry, and the walk on a Tuesday afternoon in March that was not a Thursday. These were things he chose, with the agency of a person who has found that the interior has enough warmth in it again to support choices. She gave him warmth, he made the choices. This is the distinction, and it is the correct one. I want also to describe one final thing that I have not yet described, which is the conversation between His Grace and myself on the morning of the first Thursday in November, before Miss Voss arrived. I have told the story of the conversation between Mrs. Hardcastle and myself in the pantry. I have not told the story of what I said to His Grace when I informed him that I had taken the liberty of arranging a household medical provision. I went to the library at 8 before his correspondence, and I said, "Your Grace, I wanted to inform you that I have, with Mrs. Hardcastle's concurrence, arranged for a medical provision for the household staff. A competent person from the village will come on Thursday mornings to attend to the minor ailments and preventive matters that have been managed somewhat informally until now. I believe this will be more efficient than the previous arrangement." He looked up from whatever he had been looking at. He said, "A competent person." I said, "Miss Alara Voss, Your Grace, the daughter of the late apothecary Voss, who has managed the village shop since her father's death and has a considerable local reputation. Mrs. Hardcastle knows the family." He said, "I am aware of the shop." A pause. "What sort of matters will she attend to?" I said, "The general health of the staff, minor injuries, Preventive measures for the winter. The cold season is generally difficult in a household this size, and she has some particular expertise in wound management which may be, I paused, which may be of general use. He was quiet for a moment. He said, wound management. I said, yes, Your Grace. He looked at me. I looked at the fire and did not look at him. He said, Pitsworth. I said, Your Grace. He said, you are not especially subtle. I said, no, Your Grace. I am a valet, not a diplomatist. He was quiet again. Then he said, with the dryness that was one of his more characteristic modes, on what basis has Mrs. Hardcastle selected this particular provision? I said, on the basis of Miss Voss's professional reputation and Mrs. Hardcastle's personal knowledge of the family, and on my own observation that the household's current arrangement for medical matters is somewhat lacking, and that the staff's health would benefit from more consistent attention. He said, all of these things are true. I said, yes, Your Grace. Another pause, he said, and she is to come on Thursday mornings. I said, yes, Your Grace. It seemed the most practical arrangement. He said, I see. He looked at his desk. He said, and you intend, presumably, that she should come to the library at some point during her visit, on the grounds that the household's medical provision should extend to all members of the household. I said, I had not specified the details of the arrangement in that level of precision, Your Grace. But if it seemed useful to you, then yes, I imagine that could be arranged. He said, Pitsworth. I said, Your Grace. He said, I find that I am not, on reflection, going to object to this arrangement. I said, very good, Your Grace. He said, I am going to say nothing more about it, and you are going to say nothing more about it. And on Thursday, the woman from the village will come and do whatever she does, and that will be the arrangement. I said, yes, Your Grace, that is precisely the arrangement. He returned to his correspondence. I banked the fire and went out. I stood in the passage for a moment, and I allowed myself, not a smile, because that would have been visible and I was trained out of visible reactions to things several decades ago, but the interior equivalent of a smile, which is the quiet satisfaction of a person who has thought carefully about a difficult problem, and found in the thinking a possible solution, and who has now taken the small step of making the solution available, and who can do nothing more than that, and who does not need to do more than that, because the rest belongs to other people, and to time, and to whatever it is that happens between two people when the conditions are right, and they are honest with each other. I went to see about the coal. She arrived the following Thursday at 9. She came in at the service entrance, and Mrs. Hardcastle met her and took her bag and showed her where to leave her coat, and then she sat in the small receiving room, and the staff came one by one, and she attended to them with the focused, economical competence of a person who is good at what they do and does not need to make a display of it. Bess came first with her arm, which had been troubling her since October, and Miss Voss examined it and said two things and rapped it and told her what to do about it. And Bess came out of the room with the expression of someone who has been clearly told something specific by someone who knows what they are talking about, which is a very different expression from the expression of someone who has been told something general and vague by someone who is being cautious. The morning went on. At 10, I knocked on the library door and said that the household's medical provision was available if he wished to make use of it, and he said, without looking up, send her in. She came in with her bag. She set her bag down. She looked at him directly, not at the scar, but at him, and she said, I'm Alara Voss. I understand there is a compound I might be able to offer some observations on. He looked at her. He said, sit down. She sat. They talked. The rest is the rest. I said at the beginning of this account that I was setting it down in my 61st year, for no purpose other than the purpose of setting it down. I want to say, in closing, that this is still true. I do not intend these pages for any reader, and if they are ever read it will be by accident or by someone going through my effects after I am done with them, and I will not be there to be embarrassed by them. But I find, having written them out in full, that they have accomplished something I did not entirely plan for them to accomplish, which is that in the writing I have understood more clearly than I did before what the year actually was. Not what it looked like from the outside, not the visible story of a wounded duke and the capable village woman who helped him recover, but what it actually was, which is the story of two people who had each learned to make themselves small in different ways and for different reasons, finding in each other the specific and sustaining relief of not being required to be small. He had made himself small by withdrawal. She had been made small by circumstance. Both forms produce the same result. A person who takes up less room than they should, who asks for less, who expects less, who has calibrated their requirements downward to match what the world has proven willing to provide. What they gave each other was room. The specific quality of room that comes from being looked at by someone who sees you whole and is neither frightened by the wholeness nor diminished by it. This is the gift. This is what the Thursday hours were at their core. Not the compound and not the conversation and not the walks in April or the assembly in June or the proposal in July. All of those were expressions of it. The thing itself was simpler and older and more fundamental. Room to be fully what you are, given freely, with no requirement of diminishment. 30 years of service, and I have seen this perhaps 3 times. I hold the occasions carefully. I expect I always will. The hall is warm around me. The pages are full. I put down my pen. Outside the window, the afternoon is doing what afternoon does, which is advance toward evening with the particular quiet inevitability that is the most honest thing about time. It keeps going. The light will change. The evening will come. Tomorrow will be Thursday. She will be here in the morning, as she is every morning, because Ravenscroft is her house now. The shop in the village runs 3 days a week under the management of a young woman she trained, who has the same focused competence and the same directness that was the first thing I noticed about her, and whom she speaks of with the particular warm pride of a person who is passing something forward. There is a great deal that gets passed forward in the end if you do it carefully. I have been trying to do my own part of it carefully for 40 years. The story is finished. The year is set down. Everything that happened is exactly as I have described it. I fold the pages. I put them away. I go to attend to the evening. This is all. It is more than sufficient. It is, as the youngest daughter said, simply because she loves him. It is. I want to say one final thing about the estate itself, and then I am truly done. Ravenscroft Hall is not the grandest estate in the county. It is not the oldest. It has no particular claim to historical distinction beyond the ordinary historical distinction of a great house that has been inhabited by the same family for 200 years, and that has, accordingly, the accumulated texture of 200 years of habitation. The particular worn places in the stone of the front steps that speak to the uncountable number of times someone has gone up or come down. The library that has been a library for 150 years, and that has the smell of a room that has been a library for 150 years. The kitchen garden that Mrs. Harcastle tends with the same attention her predecessor tended it, which her predecessor had from her predecessor. In the unbroken chain of institutional knowledge, that is one of the ways in which a great house actually persists across generations. I have been part of this chain for 23 years. I will be part of it for however many more years remain to me, and when I am no longer part of it, someone else will be, and the chain will continue. What I have been thinking about in the writing of this account is the specific way in which the year I have described is part of the chain. It is not a dramatic part. It will not be in any history of the estate, or in any family record, or in any document that anyone other than myself and possibly my successor in this position will ever read. It is the private part, the interior part, the part that does not show on the outside of the thing but that determines, in ways that are real even if they are invisible, what the thing actually is. The estate is what it is today in part because of what happened in the year after His Grace came home from the campaign. This is true in the obvious ways. There are 4 children, and the estate has the particular quality of a place that is inhabited by children who are happy in it. But it is also true in the less obvious ways, in the quality of the management, which has the quality of management by a person who is genuinely engaged with what he is managing, which he was not in the 5 months before November, in the quality of the relationships within the household, which have the quality of relationships in a household where the household is run with genuine attention and care, in the particular warmth of the place, which is not the warmth of the fires alone, but the warmth of a house that knows what it is and is glad of it. These things have causes, in the way that all things have causes, and the cause of these things is traceable, at least in part, to a Thursday morning in November when a woman from the village walked in through the service entrance and sat in the small receiving room, and attended to the arm that had been troubling Bess since October, and then came to the library and sat down across the desk from a man with a scar and a silence, and said, without preamble or performance, "I understand there is a compound I might be able to offer some observations on. It is traceable, at least in part, to the particular quality of attention that she brought to the room when she brought herself to it. The gray eyes and the direct gaze and the complete absence of the particular performance that the situation might have been expected to require. It is traceable, at least in part, to the fact that he looked up from his desk and looked at her and found, in what he saw, something that was worth looking at that was not his own wound. These are small things. They are the smallest possible version of the significant things. They are also, in my experience of 30 years, the only version that the significant things actually come in. Small, specific, unremarkable on the surface, visible in their full significance only in retrospect, and only to someone who is paying the kind of attention that most people are too busy or too defended to pay. I have been paying this kind of attention for 30 years. It is, perhaps, my primary qualification for the task of writing this account. In every great house I have served, I have watched the private machinery by which the visible life of the house is actually powered. The conversations in the passage, and the decisions made in the kitchen, and the small adjustments, and the silences, and the 5 seconds that no one else sees. I have watched this machinery with the attention that my profession requires, and that my temperament, I think, independently inclines me toward, because I am the kind of person who notices things and finds the noticing satisfying in itself, without any particular need to act on what is noticed. But in this house, in this year, I did act on something I noticed. I noticed that a man I had served for 23 years was in a particular difficulty that the ordinary forms of assistance available to him were not reaching. I noticed, in the conversation about Mrs. Portman's niece, the particular shape of what might reach it. I said in the pantry, with a cup of tea in front of me and Mrs. Hardcastle across the table, the thing that I had been thinking since October. This was the one time in 30 years that I stepped outside the precise boundary of my role and into something adjacent to it. Not the service of the immediate and the visible, but the service of what I could see from my particular vantage point that the person I served could not see for himself. I do not know whether this was overreach or appropriate attention. I have thought about it many times in the 12 years since, and I have not arrived at a settled conclusion. What I know is that the outcome was this: a warm house, 4 children, 2 people who found in each other the specific and irreplaceable room to be what they are. If that is the outcome of overreach, then overreach is perhaps what the occasion called for. I fold the pages for the last time. The evening is coming on. Through the window the sky is the color of the December sky of the first Thursday. Pale, clear, cold, the particular quality of a winter sky in the English countryside that gives the world a stripped and honest look. 40 years of service, 23 of them here, everything that needed setting down, set down. The house is warm. I go to attend to the Duke. One more thing. I have said I am done twice now, and I am not quite done, and I want to account for this. The reason I am not quite done is that I have been circling something in the account without quite arriving at it, and the circling will not stop unless I say the thing directly. So I will say it directly in the way that Miss Voss, in the way that Her Grace has always said the things that matter, without preliminary, without management, without performance. The thing is this: I was afraid for him. In those 5 months between July and November, I was genuinely, specifically afraid, not in the diffuse way of a person who fears generally that something might go wrong, but in the precise way of a person who can see the shape of what is going wrong, and can see that the ordinary remedies are not reaching it, and is not certain that anything is going to. I have served great houses for 30 years, and I have maintained in all of that time the professional stance appropriate to my role, which does not include fear for the people I serve as an acknowledged or expressed thing. The fear is there. It would be inhuman for it not to be, over 30 years of proximity to people and their difficulties. But it is kept where it belongs, which is in the interior, unvoiced, attended to privately, not permitted to enter the room where the work is done. In those 5 months the fear was considerable. I attended to it privately. I kept it out of the work. I did my job with the same precision I have always done my job. And in October, when I sat in the pantry with Mrs. Hardcastle and a cup of tea and thought about what might be possible, the fear was part of what was moving me, though I would not have named it as that in the moment. I named it in the moment as a practical assessment of the household's needs. But underneath the practical assessment was the fear, and underneath the fear was the 30 years and the knowledge that this specific person deserved more than what the situation was offering him. I am saying this now because the account is a private account for no audience but myself, and because I have learned in 61 years that the private true things are worth saying clearly even when, especially when, they are things you would not say in any other context. I was afraid for him. I did what I could do from the particular place where I stood. The rest was not mine to do, and I knew it was not mine, and I trusted. I had to trust, because there was nothing else to do, that the conditions I helped to arrange would produce what I believed they might produce if the people involved were who I believed them to be. They were. The fear is gone. It has been gone for 12 years. In its place is the particular quality of settled satisfaction that belongs to someone who has lived long enough to see the outcome of the things they were afraid of, and has found the outcome better than the fear. This is the private account of a valet. It is not heroic, and it is not modest, and it is not for any reader's benefit but my own. It is simply what happened, set down as truly as I can set it down by someone who was in the room, or rather in the passage, or in the service areas, or at the correct and respectful distance across the grounds, for every moment of it. I am finished. The pages go into the box. The box goes into the wardrobe. The wardrobe stays closed. The Duke of Ravenscroft is in the library. His wife is in the adjacent sitting room. Their youngest daughter is on the landing. The house is warm and fully occupied and running well. I go to attend to the evening. This is all.